I imagine myself standing at the very edge of the known world, where the sea meets the sky in an endless line of silver and gray, and beyond that line lies everything that has not yet been named. The air here is different. It carries salt and uncertainty, and the faint scent of pine tar from the docks where wooden ships creak gently against their moorings. These vessels are small by any measure, their hulls dark with pitch, their sails furled and waiting, and yet they represent something far larger than their physical dimensions could ever contain. There is a particular quality to the light in these early morning hours, before the sun has fully claimed the horizon, when the world exists in that space between darkness and dawn. And it is in this in-between time that I find myself thinking about beginnings, about the moment when humanity looked out across the water and wondered what lay beyond the visible edge of everything. The docks stretch out behind me, wooden planks worn smooth by countless footsteps, by sailors and merchants, by dreamers and desperate men, all of them drawn to this threshold between the familiar and the unknown. And if I close my eyes, I can almost hear the conversations that must have filled these spaces, whispered plans and bold declarations, calculations made with imperfect instruments and incomplete maps, those fragile documents that tried to capture certainty where none existed. I think of them now, spread across rough wooden tables in dimly lit rooms, their edges held down by stones or daggers, their surfaces marked with careful lines and speculative shapes, some portions rendered in confident ink, others trailing off into blankness, into regions labeled with warnings or decorated with imagined monsters. The world, as it was understood then, was so much smaller than the world as it actually existed, and yet this gap between understanding and reality created a kind of gravity, a pull toward the unknown that some people simply could not resist. I walk along the waterfront now, my footsteps slow and deliberate, passing coils of rope thick as a man's arm, stacks of barrels containing provisions for journeys that might last months or years, salted meat and hardtack, water that would turn brackish and questionable, supplies chosen not for comfort but for survival, because once a ship left this harbor, once it sailed beyond the sight of land, it entered a realm where resupply was impossible, where every decision made before departure would echo forward into an uncertain future. There is a certain kind of courage required to step onto one of these vessels, knowing what the departure means, knowing that the sea keeps its own counsel, that it offers no promises, no guarantees of safe passage or triumphant return. And yet the ships kept leaving, generation after generation, pulled forward by curiosity and ambition, by the need to know what existed beyond the edge of the map. I can see them in my mind, these ships setting out from harbors in Portugal and Spain, from England and the Netherlands, from Venice and Genoa, each one carrying not just cargo and crew, but also the accumulated knowledge of everyone who had sailed before. The collected wisdom of Mediterranean sailors and Arab navigators, of Viking seafarers and Polynesian wayfinders, all of that experience compressed into sailing techniques and navigation methods, into the angle of a sail and the reading of stars. The stars, those fixed points in the turning sky, became the language of direction when all other reference points disappeared, when land sank below the horizon and left only water in every direction. The sailors learned to read the heavens like a text, to find latitude in the height of Polaris above the horizon, to mark time by the progression of constellations across the night, to navigate by celestial permanence through terrestrial uncertainty. And there were other signs, subtler indicators that required patience and attention, the color of the water changing as depth decreased, the appearance of certain birds that never strayed far from land, the smell of vegetation carried on the wind, seaweed floating in particular patterns. All of these small details became significant, became the difference between finding land and sailing past it, between survival and disappearance. I find myself thinking about the silence that must have filled the long middle portions of these voyages, the days and weeks when nothing changed, when the routine of shipboard life simply repeated, watch after watch, the same faces, the same tasks, the same horizon in every direction, and in that repetition, in that sameness, the human mind begins to wonder, begins to question, begins to imagine what might be waiting just beyond the next sunrise. The urge to explore did not begin suddenly. It grew slowly, like a tide that rises so gradually you only notice it when the shoreline has completely changed. And if we trace this tide backward, if we follow it to its sources, we find ourselves in the Mediterranean world of the 13th and 14th centuries, where the foundations were being laid for journeys that would transform everything. The Italian city-states hummed with a particular kind of energy in those years, Venice and Genoa especially, their warehouses filled with goods that had traveled impossible distances, silks from China, spices from the islands of the East Indies. These items arrived through a complex chain of intermediaries, passing from hand to hand across thousands of miles, each transaction adding cost, adding mystery, adding desire. The merchants who handled these goods knew only fragments of the full story. They knew that pepper came from somewhere far to the east, that cinnamon arrived by routes they could not fully trace, that the prices they paid to Arab and Persian middlemen represented just one link in a long chain of exchange. And this fragmentary knowledge created a hunger, a need to understand the full geography of trade, to find the sources, to cut out the intermediaries and claim the profits for themselves. But the world as it was then understood presented significant barriers. The Mediterranean opened onto the Atlantic, but the Atlantic seemed to lead nowhere. The African coast stretched southward, but how far it went and where it ended remained unknown. And to the west lay only open ocean, empty and threatening, decorated on maps with warnings and speculation. The maps themselves tell us something about the limits of knowledge in this period. The Portolan charts used by Mediterranean sailors were remarkably accurate for the coastlines they knew. Detailed renderings of harbors and headlands, carefully noted depths and distances, but beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, beyond the familiar shores, the certainty dissolved into conjecture. There were stories, always stories, fragments of ancient knowledge mixed with medieval invention, tales of Saint Brendan the Navigator, who supposedly sailed west and found islands of paradise, accounts from Pliny and other classical authors describing distant lands and strange peoples. And these stories mingled with Christian cosmology and classical geography to create a worldview that was part observation, part inheritance, part imagination. Portugal emerged as an unlikely center for the systematic push beyond these boundaries, a small kingdom on the western edge of Europe, facing the Atlantic, with limited agricultural land and a population that had learned to supplement farming with fishing, with looking outward toward the sea rather than inward toward the continent. Prince Henry, later called the navigator, though he himself never sailed on these voyages, established something like a center of maritime knowledge at Sagres, on the southwestern tip of Portugal, where the land ends and the Atlantic begins. And here he gathered map makers and ship designers, astronomers and sailors, creating a space where theoretical knowledge could meet practical experience. The challenge was both technical and psychological. The ships of the early 1400s were designed for Mediterranean conditions, for relatively short distances between ports, for seas where you were rarely out of sight of land for long. The traditional round-hulled merchant vessels, the galleys powered by oars and sail, these were not adequate for extended ocean voyages into unknown waters. Gradually, through experimentation and modification, a new type of vessel emerged, the caravel, at least smaller than the great merchant ships but more maneuverable, equipped with lateen sails that allowed it to sail closer to the wind, capable of exploring coastlines and rivers, of turning back against prevailing winds, of handling the conditions that Atlantic exploration demanded. The Portuguese captains began to push southward along the African coast, moving incrementally, each voyage extending the known world by another degree, another 100 miles. Cape Bojador became a significant psychological barrier, a point beyond which sailors feared to pass, where the water was said to boil, where currents would prevent any return, where the world itself might end in catastrophe. Gil Eanes finally passed Cape Bojador in 1434 and found that the ocean beyond was simply more ocean. The water did not boil. The currents could be managed. The world continued, and this discovery, this proof that fear had been exaggerated, opened the way for further progress. The voyages continued, year after year, decade after decade, each captain carrying instructions to go beyond the point where the previous expedition had turned back, to add new information to the growing body of knowledge, to mark the coastline and note the currents, to observe the stars from new latitudes and record what they found. They began to notice patterns, the way the wind blew from certain directions at certain times of year, the existence of currents that could carry a ship far from shore, but might also provide a route home. The volta do mar, the turn of the sea, became a crucial discovery. The realization that to sail south along the African coast and then return, a ship should not simply reverse its outbound route, but instead swing far out into the Atlantic, catching different winds that would bring it back to Portugal. This was knowledge purchased with time and risk, with ships that did not return, with crews that died of scurvy or thirst, or simple exhaustion, with the slow accumulation of information about winds and currents, about coastlines and anchorages, about where fresh water could be found and where hostile forces might be encountered. The Portuguese established small fortified posts along the African coast, not colonies in the later sense, but trading stations, places where contact could be made with local populations, where gold and ivory and eventually enslaved people could be acquired, where the theoretical goal of reaching the Indies by sailing around Africa could be pursued alongside the immediate profits of African trade. Bartolomeo Diaz rounded the southern tip of Africa in 1488, pushed by storms into open water, losing sight of the land, and then finding land again to his north and east, realizing that he had passed some crucial turning point, that the continent had ended, that the way to the Indian Ocean lay open, though he called the point the Cape of Storms. Recognizing the violence of the waters where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans met, King João of Portugal renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, emphasizing possibility rather than danger, looking forward to the completion of the route that his predecessors had sought for nearly a century. The water route to the Indies that would bypass the Mediterranean, that would break the monopoly of the middlemen, that would bring the spices and silks directly to Portuguese ships. But before that route could be fully exploited, before Vasco da Gama could sail around Africa and across to India, another development had occurred, one that would eventually prove even more significant than the African route. Christopher Columbus, a Genoese sailor who had spent years seeking patronage for a different plan, finally convinced the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella to support his vision, his conviction that by sailing west across the Atlantic, by following the latitude line, he could reach the Indies more directly than any route around Africa could provide. Columbus was wrong about the distances, dramatically wrong. The Arab geographers he dismissed had more accurate measurements of the Earth's circumference, but his error was providential, because where he expected to find the coast of Asia after 3,000 miles of sailing, he instead encountered islands and continents that no European had systematically explored, lands that would eventually be called the New World, though they were, of course, not new to the millions of people already living there. The first voyage in 1492 lasted just over 2 months of actual Atlantic crossing, from the Canary Islands to the Bahamas, and in that time the crew experienced what would become familiar to later ocean voyagers: the terror of complete separation from land, the claustrophobia of the ship's small world, the uncertainty about distance and direction, the fear that the captain's calculations might be wrong, that they might sail until their supplies ran out and die of thirst with no land in sight. Columbus kept 2 logs, 1 true record and 1 false record that understated the distance traveled, meant to prevent the crew from panicking at how far they had come from Spain, how far they would have to sail to return. And this deception speaks to the psychological challenge of these voyages, the way fear and uncertainty could overwhelm even experienced sailors when land disappeared and only water remained in every direction for weeks on end. The landfall in the Bahamas changed everything, not immediately, but in its implications, in what it meant for the European understanding of geography, for the possibilities of wealth and conquest, for the future of millions of people in the Americas who would face the consequences of this contact. Columbus believed until his death that he had reached the outskirts of Asia, that the islands he explored were part of the Indies, that the mainland coasts he touched on later voyages were extensions of China or India. He died without fully understanding what he had encountered, without grasping that an entirely separate landmass existed between Europe and Asia. Other explorers would begin to piece together the truth. Amerigo Vespucci, whose name would eventually be given to the continents, recognized that this was indeed a new world, separate from Asia, and map makers began the slow process of adjusting their understanding, of adding these new coastlines to their charts, of trying to determine where this new world ended and whether a passage might exist through it to the Asian markets that remained the ultimate goal. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 divided the world between Spain and Portugal, drawing a line through the Atlantic, assigning everything to the east to Portugal and everything to the west to Spain, an act of breathtaking presumption, two European kingdoms claiming the right to divide the entire globe between them based on the authority of the Pope, with no consideration for the people already living in the territories being allocated. This division of the unknown, this carving up of territories that had not yet been explored, set the pattern for what would follow. And in the decades after 1494, Spanish and Portuguese expeditions fanned out across the Atlantic and beyond, each voyage adding fragments to the growing picture of what the world actually contained. The Spanish focused on the lands Columbus had encountered, sending expedition after expedition to the Caribbean, to the mainland coasts of Central and South America, and what they found there exceeded their expectations in ways both wonderful and terrible. Civilizations of sophisticated complexity, cities larger than most European capitals, agricultural systems that supported millions of people, astronomical knowledge, architectural achievements, artistic traditions of remarkable subtlety. Hernán Cortés encountered the Aztec Empire in 1519, arriving in a world of causeways and canals, of floating gardens and massive pyramids, of a capital city, Tenochtitlan, that held perhaps 200,000 people, with the markets that displayed goods from across Mesoamerica, with social hierarchies and religious practices and political structures that had developed over centuries without any European influence. The encounter was not one of primitive meeting advanced, but of different meeting different. The Spanish had advantages in certain technologies, steel weapons and horses and eventually disease, while the Aztecs had advantages in numbers and knowledge of the terrain and complex diplomatic relationships with surrounding peoples. What followed was not inevitable conquest, but rather a process of alliance and betrayal, of epidemic disease that killed millions, of political maneuvering and violent conflict that eventually resulted in Spanish control. Further south, Francisco Pizarro encountered the Inca Empire, a realm that stretched for thousands of miles along the western coast of South America, connected by road systems that crossed mountains and deserts, administered through a complex bureaucracy, sustained by agricultural terracing and irrigation systems that transformed steep mountainsides into productive farmland, organized around a divine ruler and a cosmology that saw no separation between the political and the sacred. The Spanish conquistadors were not scientists or anthropologists. They were adventurers and soldiers, seeking wealth and status, operating with a worldview that saw non-Christian peoples as legitimate targets for conquest, and they documented what they found through that lens, producing accounts that mixed accurate observation with prejudice and misunderstanding, describing cities and customs and battles with a perspective that justified their own actions while revealing fragments of the worlds they were destroying. Meanwhile, the Portuguese finally completed the route that their explorers had been seeking for nearly a century. Vasco da Gama sailed around the Cape of Good Hope in 1497, crossed the Indian Ocean with the help of an Arab pilot, and reached Calicut on the southwest coast of India in 1498, establishing direct contact with the spice markets that had been the ultimate goal all along. The Indian Ocean was not an empty frontier. It was a space of ancient trade routes, of established commercial networks linking East Africa and Arabia and India and the islands of Southeast Asia, of monsoon winds that dictated sailing seasons, of merchant communities and port cities and cultural exchanges that had been functioning for centuries before the first Portuguese ship arrived. The Portuguese entered this world as disruptors, using their ships as weapons, their cannons giving them advantages in naval combat that allowed them to seize control of strategic ports and demand access to trade, establishing a network of fortified trading posts from Mozambique to Malacca, from Hormuz to Goa, creating an empire not of territorial control but of maritime dominance, of control over sea lanes and harbors rather than land and populations. Alfonso de Albuquerque captured Goa in 1510 and made it the center of Portuguese operations in Asia, captured Malacca in 1511, gaining control over the strait through which much of the spice trade passed, attempted to capture Aden to control access to the Red Sea, and in doing so demonstrated the Portuguese strategy not to conquer vast territories, but to control the choke points, the places where control over shipping could translate into control over commerce. The world was revealing itself to be both larger and more interconnected than European geography had imagined. The continents were separate but not isolated. Goods and ideas and people had been moving between Africa and Asia, and Europe and the Americas, for far longer than the explorers understood. And the age of European exploration was not the discovery of empty spaces, but rather the violent insertion of European power into networks and systems that already existed. Ferdinand Magellan conceived a plan even more ambitious than reaching India by sailing east. He proposed to reach the Spice Islands by sailing west, to find a passage through or around the American continents, and then cross the Pacific to circumnavigate the entire globe and prove finally and definitively what its true dimensions were, what relationship the continents had to each other, whether the world was indeed a sphere that could be sailed around. The expedition departed Spain in 1519 with 5 ships and approximately 270 men, and what followed was one of the most harrowing journeys in the history of exploration. Months spent searching for a passage through South America, finally finding a strait at the continent's southern tip, threading through channels between icy cliffs, losing ships to storms and desertion, emerging finally into an ocean so vast that Magellan named it Pacific, peaceful, though the crossing would prove anything but peaceful for the men who attempted it. The Pacific crossing took far longer than Magellan had anticipated. The ocean was wider than European geography had allowed for, and the fleet sailed for month after month across empty water, running out of fresh food, reduced to eating leather and rats, suffering from scurvy as their bodies broke down from lack of vitamin C, men dying and being buried at sea, the ships themselves deteriorating, sails rotting, rigging failing, the entire expedition balanced on the edge of catastrophe. They finally reached the Philippines in 1521, and there Magellan involved himself in local politics, allied himself with one ruler against another, and died in a skirmish on the beach at Mactan, killed by warriors led by Lapu-Lapu, demonstrating that European technology and tactics did not guarantee victory, that the explorers and conquistadors were mortal and vulnerable, that the people they encountered could and did resist. The expedition continued without Magellan, reduced now to 3 ships and fewer than 150 men, reaching the Spice Islands loading cargo, and then facing the question of how to return. One ship attempted to sail back across the Pacific but failed, turned back by storms and adverse winds. Another ship stayed in the Spice Islands. Only the Victoria, under the command of Juan Sebastian Elcano, managed to sail across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, and back to Spain. The Victoria arrived in September of 1522, 3 years after departure, with only 18 of the original crew still alive, carrying a cargo of cloves and cinnamon valuable enough to pay for the entire expedition. But more valuable than the spices was the knowledge they brought back, the proof that the earth could be circumnavigated, that the Pacific was indeed an ocean and not a narrow sea, that the world was far larger than the classical geographers had calculated. The map makers now had to reconfigure their understanding completely to fit together the pieces of a coastline that different expeditions had traced, to acknowledge the vast scale of the Pacific, to show 2 separate continents in the Western Hemisphere, to indicate the distances and relationships that were becoming clearer with each returning ship. English and French expeditions began to probe the northern coastlines of the Americas, searching for a northwest passage, a route that might lead through or around North America to the Pacific and the riches of Asia. John Cabot sailed to Newfoundland in 1497. Jacques Cartier explored the St. Lawrence River in the 1530s. These northern waters offered fish in abundance, the Grand Banks teeming with cod. But they did not offer the easy passage to Asia that the explorers sought. The search for this passage would continue for centuries, drawing expedition after expedition into the Arctic, into waters choked with ice, into channels that seemed promising but led only to dead ends. The geography of the northern route was complex and dangerous, and the Northwest Passage would not be successfully navigated until the early 20th century, long after its commercial value had disappeared. But the search itself was productive in other ways. It mapped coastlines. It established claims to territory. It brought back knowledge of lands and peoples and resources. It created the foundation for later colonization and exploitation. The fishing fleets that would harvest the Grand Banks, the fur trade that would draw Europeans deep into the interior of North America, the eventual settlement that would displace and destroy indigenous populations. The Spanish pushed northward from Mexico, exploring what would become the southwestern United States, searching for cities of gold that existed only in rumor and imagination. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led an expedition through present-day Arizona and New Mexico and Kansas in 1540 and 1541, finding pueblos and plains and the Grand Canyon, finding peoples who had lived in these regions for thousands of years, but not finding the golden cities that had motivated the journey. These failures to find imaginary wealth did not stop the expeditions. Each disappointing result was simply reinterpreted. The gold must be further north, further west, in the next valley, beyond the next range of mountains. And so the exploration continued, driven by hope and greed, and the conviction that somewhere in this vast new world there must be riches comparable to what the Spanish had found in Mexico and Peru. The English privateers began to challenge Spanish dominance in the later 16th century. Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe between 1577 and 1580, raiding Spanish settlements along the Pacific coast of the Americas. Claiming California for England, demonstrating that Spanish control of these waters was not absolute, that other nations could and would contest for access and profit. Drake's voyage was both exploration and piracy, mapping and plundering, adding to geographical knowledge while also seizing Spanish gold and silver. His ship, the Golden Hind, returned to England laden with treasure, and Drake himself became a symbol of English maritime ambition, of the possibility that a smaller nation could challenge Spanish and Portuguese dominance through superior seamanship and daring. The Dutch entered the competition as well, building on their experience as traders and shipbuilders, creating the Dutch East India Company in 1602, a corporation granted monopoly rights to Dutch trade in Asia, equipped with the power to make treaties and wage war, to establish colonies and administer justice, essentially functioning as a state within a state, pursuing profit through any means necessary. The Dutch focused their efforts on the East Indies, on the islands that produced nutmeg and cloves and other spices, displacing the Portuguese from many of their strongholds, establishing Batavia, modern Jakarta, as the center of their Asian operations, creating a network of trade and control that would persist for centuries, that would make the Netherlands enormously wealthy, even as the human cost in the colonized territories was staggering. Willem Janszoon reached the coast of Australia in 1606, the first confirmed European landing on the continent, though he did not recognize it as a separate landmass, thought it was part of New Guinea, and the Dutch would continue to encounter the western and northern coasts of Australia throughout the 17th century without finding anything that seemed valuable enough to justify colonization. Abel Tasman circumnavigated Australia without actually seeing the eastern coast, proving it was an island continent, discovering Tasmania and New Zealand in 1642 and 1643, encountering the Maori, describing lands and peoples that would later become targets for British colonization, but again finding nothing that attracted immediate Dutch interest, no spices, no obvious sources of wealth, just coastlines and indigenous populations and territories that seemed difficult and unrewarding. The English and French established rival claims in North America, creating colonies that survived through tremendous hardship. Jamestown in 1607, Plymouth in 1620, Quebec in 1608. These settlements represented a different model of colonization than the Spanish had pursued, not conquest of existing empires, but rather the establishment of agricultural colonies, the displacement of indigenous peoples to create European societies transplanted to new soil. The colonists faced starvation and disease, conflict with indigenous populations who recognized these settlements as invasions, winters that killed those unprepared for the climate, summers that brought malaria and dysentery. The early years of these colonies saw mortality rates of 50% or higher, saw desperate struggles for survival, saw the gradual realization that this was not going to be easy, that the land would not simply yield its wealth, that success would require adaptation and endurance and often violence. The fur trade drew French explorers deep into the interior of North America, following rivers and lakes, establishing relationships with indigenous nations, learning to travel by canoe and snowshoe, to survive in environments completely different from anything in Europe. Samuel de Champlain mapped the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes in the early 1600s, creating alliances with Huron and Algonquin peoples, involving himself in their conflicts with the Iroquois Confederacy, beginning patterns of alliance and warfare that would shape North American history for the next 2 centuries. The English Hudson's Bay Company received its charter in 1670, claiming rights to all the territory drained by rivers flowing into Hudson Bay, a vast area that included much of what would become Canada. And the company established trading posts where indigenous trappers could exchange furs for European goods, creating economic relationships that transformed indigenous societies, that introduced new technologies and new dependencies, that disrupted traditional ways of life in exchange for cloth and metal tools and guns. The Pacific remained the least explored of the world's oceans into the 18th century, its vast distances and scattered islands making systematic exploration difficult. But gradually the picture filled in. Russian explorers pushed eastward across Siberia, reached the Pacific coast, explored the Aleutian Islands and Alaska, establishing claims that would eventually lead to Russian settlements as far south as California. James Cook made 3 great voyages of Pacific exploration between 1768 and 1779, mapping New Zealand and the eastern coast of Australia, exploring the Hawaiian Islands, searching for the theoretical southern continent that geographers believed must exist to balance the land masses of the northern hemisphere, proving that no such continent existed at habitable latitudes, charting islands and reefs and coastlines with unprecedented accuracy. Cook's expeditions were scientific as well as geographical, carrying astronomers to observe the transit of Venus, collecting botanical specimens, documenting indigenous peoples and their cultures with more care than earlier explorers had shown, though this documentation was still filtered through European assumptions and prejudices, still part of a larger project of claiming and categorizing and ultimately controlling. Cook died in Hawaii in 1779, killed in a confrontation that arose from misunderstandings and escalating tensions, his death coming in the same islands where he had been welcomed months earlier, demonstrating again the fragility of these encounters, the way initial cooperation could collapse into violence, the consequences of cultural misunderstanding when backed by firearms and ships. By the end of the 18th century, the general outlines of world geography were known to Europeans. The continents had been mapped, the major islands located, the coastlines traced with increasing accuracy. What remained were the interiors, the vast territories of Africa and Asia, and the Americas where European knowledge was still fragmentary or absent, where indigenous peoples maintained their independence and their own geographical understanding, where the map still showed blank spaces waiting to be filled, but the nature of exploration was changing. The early period of dramatic discovery was over. No more unknown continents would be found, no more ocean crossings into complete uncertainty. What remained was detailed survey work, the filling in of particulars, the establishment of precise latitudes and longitudes, the creation of maps that could serve imperial administration and commercial exploitation. The motivations had clarified as well, the romantic idea of exploration for its own sake, the desire to know what lay beyond the horizon. These had always been secondary to more material concerns. The search for wealth and trade routes, for souls to convert and territories to claim, for advantage over rival nations and access to resources. And by the late 18th century, these material motivations were completely dominant. the interior of Africa became a particular focus. The coastlines had been known for centuries. Trading posts and slave forts dotted the shores, but the vast interior remained unknown to Europeans, protected by disease, by difficult terrain, by powerful kingdoms that had their own reasons for limiting European access. The Niger River's course was uncertain. The location of Timbuktu was disputed. The source of the Nile remained one of geography's great mysteries. European explorers began to penetrate these interiors in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Mungo Park traced portions of the Niger. Dying on his second expedition, Richard Burton and John Hanning Speke searched for the source of the Nile, their expedition ending in bitter dispute over which lake they had found. David Livingstone crossed the continent multiple times, disappearing for years, found by Henry Morton Stanley in a meeting that became famous, though perhaps apocryphal, in its details. These explorations were preludes to colonization. The geographical knowledge they produced would be used to justify and enable the European partition of Africa in the late 19th century. The drawing of borders that ignored existing political structures and cultural boundaries, the division of the continent among European powers in a scramble for territory and resources that would have devastating consequences lasting to the present day. The same pattern played out elsewhere: geographical knowledge serving imperial expansion, maps becoming tools of control, the blank spaces on the map not representing absence of knowledge, but rather absence of European knowledge. Indigenous peoples had their own maps, their own geographical understanding, their own names for rivers and mountains and regions, but these were systematically displaced by European cartography, replaced by names chosen by explorers and administrators, by borders drawn in European capitals. The age of exploration as it had begun in the 15th century was effectively over by the mid-19th century. The world had been circumnavigated, the continents located, the major geographical features identified. What followed was not exploration, but rather survey and conquest, the detailed mapping that serves administration, the resource assessment that serves extraction, the establishment of control over territories and peoples. And yet something had been learned in those centuries of voyaging. The world was indeed round, could be sailed around. The continents were separate, but connected by oceans that could be crossed. The peoples of the world were diverse, but recognizably human, practicing agriculture and building cities and creating art and developing philosophies and governing themselves according to their own systems. The exploration had revealed not European superiority, but rather human commonality, though this lesson was largely ignored by those who preferred conquest to understanding. The ships themselves deserve consideration. These wooden vessels that made the journeys possible, built from trees that had grown for decades or centuries, shaped by hands that understood the relationship between grain and strength, between curve and speed, between weight and stability. Each ship a synthesis of accumulated knowledge, of trial and error spanning generations. A caravel under construction was a beautiful thing, the ribs rising like the skeleton of some great creature, the planks fitted and caulked, the deck laid, the masts stepped, and finally the sails, canvas woven from flax or hemp, cut and sewn to catch the wind, to translate invisible air into forward motion, into the power that could carry a ship across thousands of miles of ocean. The sailors who crewed these vessels lived in conditions of remarkable hardship, sleeping in cramped quarters below deck, eating food that deteriorated over the course of long voyages, hardtack that became infested with weevils, salt meat that turned rancid, water that grew brackish and foul, the monotony of the shipboard routine broken only by storms, and the constant work of maintaining the vessel, repairing sails, splicing rope, pumping bilge water, and yet they signed on voyage after voyage, these men, drawn by wages or adventure, or the simple need for employment, by the possibility of prize money if they sailed with privateers, by the hope of returning with stories and status, by the camaraderie of a shipboard life. The bonds formed between people who depend absolutely on each other for survival. The navigation was an art as much as a science, the instruments imperfect, the astrolabe and cross-staff, and later the sextant, tools for measuring angles between celestial bodies and the horizon, for determining latitude with reasonable accuracy, but longitude remained uncertain until the development of reliable chronometers in the 18th century, until time could be carried accurately across the oceans, allowing the calculation of distance east or west. Before chronometers, longitude was estimated, dead reckoning they called it, tracking speed and direction, accounting for currents and drift, accepting that error would accumulate. That position was always somewhat uncertain, and the navigators learned to read other signs, the color of water indicating depth and the presence of birds suggesting land, the smell of vegetation on the wind, all the subtle indicators that experience taught them to notice and interpret. The cultural exchanges that resulted from these explorations were complex and multi-directional, not simply Europeans imposing their ways on the rest of the world, though that certainly happened, but also Europeans adopting and adapting, learning to eat maize and potatoes and tomatoes, crops that would transform European agriculture, learning to use hammocks and canoes, practical technologies developed by indigenous peoples, learning words and concepts that had no European equivalents. The Columbian Exchange, as historians call it, involved the transfer of plants and animals and diseases between hemispheres, horses and cattle and pigs spreading through the Americas, transforming indigenous ways of life, enabling new forms of transportation and warfare and food production, while American crops, potatoes and maize especially, spread through Europe and Asia and Africa, eventually feeding populations that could not have been sustained without them. But the exchange also involved smallpox and measles and typhus, diseases that swept through indigenous populations with devastating effect, killing millions who had no immunity, depopulating entire regions, creating demographic catastrophes that exceeded anything in European experience, that made conquest easier because the populations being conquered had already been decimated by invisible enemies they could not fight. The mixing of populations that resulted from exploration and colonization created new cultures, Creole languages blending European and African and indigenous elements, musical traditions that fused different rhythms and instruments and scales, cuisines that combined ingredients and techniques from multiple continents, religious practices that merged Catholic saints with African or indigenous deities, creating syncretic traditions that were genuinely new, that belonged fully to none of the parent cultures, but rather to the particular circumstances of colonial encounter. The philosophical implications of the discoveries were profound. The realization that the classical authorities had been wrong about the size of the earth, that entire continents existed unknown to Ptolemy and Pliny, that human societies had developed in complete isolation from the Mediterranean world, following different trajectories, creating different solutions to common problems. This challenged European certainty about the universality of their own traditions and truths, and yet this challenge was largely deflected, absorbed into narratives of European superiority, the diversity of human cultures reinterpreted as a hierarchy, with European civilization at the apex and other peoples arranged below, according to their supposed level of development. The exploration that could have taught humility instead fed arrogance. The encounter that could have generated mutual learning instead justified domination. The maps tell this story in their own way. The early charts, with their blank spaces and speculative coastlines, gradually filling with detail, with names chosen by explorers, with borders that would become the foundations of colonial empires, the geography becoming fixed, codified, turned into something that could be owned and administered and exploited. But there were always other maps, indigenous maps that showed different features, that organized space according to different principles, that marked sacred sites and seasonal movements and kinship territories. These maps were rarely recorded in forms that survived, but they existed in memory and practice, in the way people moved through their lands, in the stories they told about places and the relationships between them. The age of exploration transformed the world, connected populations that had been separate, initiated processes of exchange and conquest that continue to shape the present, created the foundations of global trade and global inequality, of cultural mixture and cultural destruction, of scientific knowledge and imperial violence, all of these things tangled together, inseparable in their origins, even as we might wish to celebrate some aspects while condemning others. And so I find myself back at the harbor where this reflection began, watching the water move against the pilings, listening to the creak of wood and rope, thinking about all the voyages that started from places like this, all the departures into uncertainty, all the knowledge gained and the costs paid for that knowledge. The light is different now, the sun higher. The quality of the illumination changed from that liminal dawn moment, but the essential character of the place remains, this threshold between land and sea, between the known and the unknown, between what we carry with us and what we might find beyond the horizon. I think about the courage required, not the mindless courage of recklessness, but the courage that acknowledges fear and proceeds anyway, that understands the risks and accepts them, that knows the voyage might end in death, but chooses to sail regardless. This courage animated the expeditions, whatever we might think of their purposes, whatever judgment we pass on their consequences. And I think about the curiosity, the desire to know, to see what lies beyond, to understand how the pieces fit together. This curiosity is fundamentally human, appears in every culture, in every period. The stories of exploration exist in every tradition, not just European. The Polynesian navigators who settled the Pacific Islands, the Arab merchants who crossed the Indian Ocean, the Chinese fleets that reached East Africa. The human impulse to explore transcends any particular culture or moment. The water continues its eternal movement, rising and falling with the tide, moving with currents that flow according to their own logic, indifferent to human purposes, indifferent to the ships that cross its surface, indifferent to the civilizations that rise and fall along its shores. And there is something comforting in this indifference, in the reminder that the natural world operates according to principles that predate and will outlast all human endeavor. I watch a bird. I cannot tell what species from this distance, gliding low over the water, its wings outstretched and motionless, riding the air currents with effortless grace. And I think about how this bird navigates, how it knows where it is going, what internal compass guides it, what combination of instinct and learning and observation allows it to move so confidently through its element. The human navigators had to learn what the bird knows innately, had to develop tools and techniques to replace the natural abilities they lacked, had to chart the stars and measure angles and record observations, had to build understanding through accumulated experience, through mistakes and corrections, through the slow process of turning mystery into knowledge. The shadows are lengthening now, the day moving toward evening, and the quality of the light becomes golden, softer than the bright clarity of midday, more forgiving, the kind of light that makes everything seem gentler, more distant, as if the hard edges of the world are dissolving into possibility. I imagine the sailors in their final hours before departure, saying goodbye to people they might never see again, carrying the weight of all the things left unsaid, all the ordinary moments they would miss, all the births and deaths and daily dramas of the communities they were leaving, carrying this weight along with their sea chests and their hopes and their fears, stepping aboard vessels that would become their entire world for months or years. And I imagine them years later, the survivors, returning to harbors that had changed in their absence, stepping onto docks that felt foreign after so long at sea, carrying memories of things they could barely describe, of lands and peoples so different from anything their listeners had experienced that the stories must have seemed like fiction, like tales from some romance or legend, rather than accounts of actual places and events. The gaps between experience and communication, between what was seen and what could be told, these gaps must have been vast. How do you explain the scale of the Pacific to someone who has never left the Mediterranean? How do you describe the jungle or the desert or the ice? How do you convey the terror of a storm at sea, the wonder of an unknown shore? The complex humanity of people who live according to completely different assumptions. The light fades further, the sun dropping toward the horizon, and the water takes on the colors of the sky, blues and purples and hints of orange, the whole scene becoming softer, quieter, as if the world itself is settling into rest after the exertions of the day. I think about all the knowledge that was lost, all the indigenous understanding that was never recorded, all the navigational expertise and ecological wisdom and historical memory that disappeared when populations were decimated, when languages died, when oral traditions were interrupted. The exploration added to European knowledge, but it also subtracted from human knowledge, destroyed as much as it discovered, and this loss is incalculable, permanent, irretrievable. The stars are beginning to appear now, faint points of light in the deepening blue, and I think about how these same stars guided the navigators, how celestial permanence served terrestrial wandering, how the fixed patterns of the heavens allowed humanity to chart the changes of the earth. This relationship between the eternal and the temporal, between what persists and what passes, between the stars that remain and the voyages that end. The water darkens, the details disappearing into shadow, leaving only the essential forms, the line between sea and sky, the silhouettes of distant ships, the slow rhythm of waves against the shore. And in this simplification, in this reduction to essentials, there is a kind of peace, a quieting of the constant analysis, a return to simple presence, to being here, now, at the edge of the sea, where so many journeys began. I step into the quiet space between the ancient stones, where the area itself seems to carry the weight of 1,000 generations. There is something profound in the way human beings reach toward meaning, the way we have always sought patterns in the cosmos and answers to questions that emerge in the deepest hours of contemplation. For as long as we have gazed at stars, we have wondered. The great religions of the world are not simply collections of beliefs. They are living rivers, each one flowing through centuries, carrying stories and practices, customs and devotions from distant origins toward shores we cannot yet see. Tonight, I find myself wandering through this vast landscape of human longing, moving softly through temples and texts, rituals and revelations, not as a pilgrim seeking conversion, but as someone who simply wishes to witness, to understand the contours of these paths that billions have walked before. There is a hillside somewhere in my imagination, and from this vantage point, I can see the way these traditions have shaped the world, the way they have carved meaning into the raw stone of existence, giving structure to joy and sorrow, birth and death, offering frameworks for the fundamental questions that rise in every human heart. The moonlight falls differently here, illuminating fragments of history, moments when individuals stood at crossroads and chose, when communities formed around shared understanding, when words were spoken that would echo through millennia. I think of the earliest humans, gathering around fires in the darkness, their faces turned toward flame and shadow, already asking why, already sensing something beyond the visible, beyond the tangible. In those circles, before writing, before cities, before empires, the seeds of what would become the great religions were already germinating in human consciousness. From the steppes of Central Asia to the river valleys of the Indus and the Nile, from the deserts of Arabia to the terraced mountains of East Asia, different peoples in different times began to crystallize their wonder into systems, their intuitions into practices, their encounters with the numinous into traditions that would guide their descendants. These traditions would grow, branch, merge, and diverge. They would inspire art of breathtaking beauty and architecture that defies imagination. They would spark both profound compassion and devastating conflict, motivate saints and scholars, mystics and merchants. They would shape law codes and ethical systems, influence philosophy and science, permeate music and literature, and touch nearly every aspect of human culture. But here, in this quiet hour, I am not concerned with grand historical movements or theological debates. I am simply tracing the threads, following the paths, listening to the whispers of meaning that have sustained humanity across the ages. I see a monastery perched on a cliff face, its walls ochre in the fading light. Prayer flags flutter in the mountain wind, carrying intentions into the infinite sky. Somewhere far below, a river winds through green valleys, indifferent to the devotions offered above. I see a mosque at twilight, its minarets rising like fingers pointing towards something beyond. The call to prayer drifts across rooftops and alleyways, a reminder that has marked the rhythm of days for countless generations. Inside, geometric patterns of impossible intricacy draw the eye inward, toward center, toward unity. I see a cathedral with stained glass windows that transform ordinary sunlight into cascades of color, telling stories to those who cannot read, offering beauty as a form of prayer. The vaulted ceiling arches overhead, creating space that feels somehow larger than the physical dimensions would suggest. I see a temple complex where incense smoke curls upward, where offerings of flowers and fruit are laid before representations of the divine in myriad forms, where the boundaries between the sacred and the everyday blur into something continuous, something whole. Each of these spaces, and countless others, serves as a doorway, a threshold between the ordinary world and something else, something that different traditions name differently, but perhaps in some mysterious way point toward with similar longing. And so I begin to walk slowly through this landscape of human seeking, letting the details accumulate like snow falling softly on winter ground, each flake distinct, each contributing to the quiet beauty of the whole. The story begins in places so ancient that certainty dissolves into legend, into fragments of pottery and faded inscriptions, into oral traditions passed from generation to generation before anyone thought to write them down. In the river valleys of the Indus, more than 4,000 years ago, a civilization flourished. Cities rose with sophisticated drainage systems and planned streets, and though the script they left behind remains undeciphered, the seals and figurines suggest a people already engaged with questions of the sacred. Already there were ritual baths suggesting purification. Already there were symbols that hint at devotion. From this ancient Indus culture and from the migrations of peoples who called themselves Arya, the noble ones, there emerged over centuries what would become the oldest living religious tradition, the Vedas. Collections of hymns and rituals were composed and preserved with such precision that scholars marvel at their faithful transmission across millennia. These were not written initially, but memorized, chanted, passed from teacher to student in an unbroken chain of sound. The Rig Veda speaks of cosmic principles, of Indra, the storm god, and Agni, the fire, of Rita, the fundamental order underlying all existence. The priests who tended the sacred fires understood themselves as maintaining the very structure of reality through their rituals, through their perfect pronunciation of sacred syllables that held power in their sound itself. But this was only the beginning. For over centuries, the tradition that would become known as Hinduism, though that name came much later, continued to evolve. The Upanishads emerged, philosophical texts that questioned the earlier ritual focus, that turned inward, seeking Brahman, the ultimate reality, and Atman, the essential self, exploring the possibility that these two, the cosmic and the individual, might be fundamentally one. Far to the east, in the land that would become China, other ancient currents were flowing. In the Yellow River Valley, Bronze Age kingdoms rose and fell, and people sought to understand the patterns of heaven and earth. The concept of Tian, heaven, emerged, a cosmic force that granted legitimacy to rulers and demanded ethical conduct. By the time of the Zhou dynasty, around 3,000 years ago, the Chinese had developed elaborate systems of divination, of ancestor veneration, of ritual propriety. They understood the world as animated by forces that required careful negotiation, by spirits that demanded respect. Into this world, in the 6th century before the Common Era, came a remarkable flowering of wisdom. In China, a scholar named Kong Fuzi, known to the West as Confucius, gathered students and taught a path of ethical cultivation. He spoke of Ren, humaneness, of Lai, ritual propriety, of the importance of education and self-cultivation in creating a harmonious society. Confucius looked backward to what he believed was a golden age of virtuous rulers, and forward to a world where people might embody these ancient virtues in their daily lives. He taught that society depended not on laws alone, but on the cultivation of character, that a ruler should lead through the moral example. That relationship should be governed by reciprocal duties and sincere respect. At nearly the same time, another Chinese sage whose name means old master, Laozi, supposedly wrote a brief text of profound paradoxes. The Tao Te Ching spoke of the Tao, the way, a principle that flows through all things, that cannot be named or grasped, but can perhaps be followed. It advocated Wu Wei, effortless action, alignment with natural patterns rather than forceful intervention, where Confucius emphasized social harmony through proper conduct. Taoism pointed toward spontaneity, toward the wisdom of water that flows around obstacles, toward the strength found in yielding. The two traditions would coexist in Chinese culture, complementary rather than contradictory, offering different lenses through which to view existence. But perhaps the most significant birth in that remarkable 6th century occurred in the foothills of the Himalayas, where a prince named Siddhartha Gautama sat beneath a tree and vowed not to rise until he understood the nature of suffering and its cessation. Siddhartha had been raised in luxury, protected from the harsh realities of life, but when he finally encountered old age, sickness, and death, he was shaken to his core. He renounced his princely life, became an ascetic, practiced severe austerities, and nearly died from self-mortification. Finally, realizing that neither indulgence nor extreme asceticism led to liberation, he sat in meditation beneath what would become known as the Bodhi tree. And there, after a night of deep meditation, he achieved enlightenment, awakening to the nature of reality and the path to freedom from suffering. The Buddha, the awakened one, spent the remaining 45 years of his life teaching what he had discovered: the Four Noble Truths, that suffering exists, that it has a cause, that it can cease, and that there is a path to its cessation, the Eightfold Path: right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. His teaching spread through India, attracting monks and lay people, kings and merchants. It offered a path that did not depend on the Vedic rituals, that did not require a priestly class, that emphasized personal practice and direct experience. Monasteries formed. The Sangha, the community of practitioners, grew, and the Dharma, the teaching, began its long journey across Asia. Meanwhile, in the lands around the Mediterranean, other traditions were taking shape. The people who would become known as Jews traced their origins to Abraham, who left the city of Ur perhaps 4,000 years ago. called by a voice to journey to an unknown land, to enter into covenant with a God who was not merely the strongest among many gods, but the only God, creator of heaven and earth. This was a revolutionary idea, monotheism, the insistence that there is one God alone. Through the stories of the patriarchs, through the Exodus from Egypt under Moses, through the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, the Jewish people developed an identity bound to this covenant, to a law that governed every aspect of life, to a land promised to them, to a sense of being chosen for a particular purpose in history. The prophets arose, speaking with fierce moral clarity, demanding justice, condemning empty ritual divorced from ethical action, insisting that God desired mercy and righteousness more than burnt offerings, Isaiah and Jeremiah, Amos and Hosea. Their words burned with passion for a society that reflected divine justice, even when the temple was destroyed and the people exiled to Babylon. The tradition adapted, survived, deepened. The rabbis began the work of interpretation that would continue for millennia, developing the Talmud, exploring the infinite applications of Torah to daily life, creating a portable religion that could survive without a temple, without a land, sustained by text and practice and community. In Persia, a prophet named Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, preached a cosmic dualism, a universe where the forces of good and evil were locked in struggle, where humans had free will to choose which side they would support. This ancient Persian faith would influence later traditions, its ideas seeping into Jewish apocalyptic thought, into early Christian concepts of heaven and hell, of final judgment and resurrection. As centuries passed, these traditions grew and changed. Buddhism split into different schools, the Theravada, the way of the elders, preserving what it saw as the original teachings, and the Mahayana, this great vehicle, which developed new scriptures and emphasized the bodhisattva ideal, the being who postpones final liberation to help all sentient beings achieve freedom. In China, Buddhism encountered Confucianism and Taoism, and the collision produced new forms, Chan Buddhism, which would travel to Japan and become Zen, emphasized direct experience, meditation, and the possibility of sudden awakening. It spoke in paradoxes, in koans that short-circuited logical thinking, pointing directly to the nature of mind. Hinduism, too, was evolving. The great epics were taking shape. The Mahabharata, with its jewel, the Bhagavad Gita, where the god Krishna counseled the warrior Arjuna on duty and devotion, the Ramayana with its tales of dharma and exile. These stories would shape Indian culture for millennia, providing models of proper conduct, exploring the tensions between duty and desire, justice and mercy. Devotional movements emerged, bhakti, emphasizing love and surrender to personal deities, Shiva, Vishnu, the goddess, in her many forms. The temple became a place where the divine could be approached through sight, through darshan, where offerings and rituals created relationship between the human and the sacred. And then, in the 1st century of the Common Era, in the Roman province of Judea, a Jewish teacher named Jesus gathered followers and proclaimed the coming of God's kingdom. His teachings emphasized love, forgiveness, compassion for the marginalized. He challenged religious authorities, ate with outcasts, and spoke of a God whose love extended beyond the boundaries of the chosen people. His crucifixion by the Romans seemed to end his movement, But his followers proclaimed that he had risen from death, that he was the Messiah, the Christ, the Anointed One, that through his death and resurrection, humanity could be reconciled to God, freed from the power of sin and death. This message spread rapidly through the Roman Empire. Paul of Tarsus, a persecutor of the early church who became its greatest advocate, carried the gospel to Gentile communities, arguing that faith in Christ transcended the requirements of Jewish law, that Jew and Greek, slave and free, male and female were all one in Christ Jesus. Christianity grew despite periodic persecutions, or perhaps because of them. The blood of martyrs became seed. Communities formed, developed structures and creeds, argued over the nature of Christ, fully divine or fully human or somehow mysteriously both. These debates would lead to councils, to the formulation of orthodox doctrine, to splits between East and West, between those who accepted the Council of Chalcedon and those who did not. By the 4th century, when the Roman Emperor Constantine converted and Christianity became first tolerated and then the official religion of the empire, the tradition had already spread far beyond the Mediterranean to Ethiopia, to Armenia, to communities scattered from Spain to India. Monasticism emerged, first in the deserts of Egypt, where individuals fled the corruption of the world, seeking God in solitude and prayer, then in communities bound by rules like that of Benedict, offering an alternative to the warrior culture and material striving of the age. The monasteries became centers of learning, preserving classical texts through the chaos of empire's collapse, copying manuscripts by candlelight, maintaining islands of literacy in a sea of turbulence, and all across the world, in ways both parallel and intersecting, human beings continued to seek, to question, to build systems of meaning and practice that could hold the weight of existence. The great religions were finding their forms, establishing their scriptures and rituals, their communities and institutions, not yet knowing how they would collide and combine in centuries to come. The 7th century brought new thunder to the world, a voice crying out in the desert, proclaiming the unity of God with an urgency that would reshape continents. In the city of Mecca, in the Arabian Peninsula, a merchant named Muhammad began to receive revelations, visions that came to him in a cave on Mount Hira, where the angel Jibril commanded him to recite. At first he doubted, feared he was going mad, but his wife Khadijah believed in him, and the revelations continued, pouring forth in Arabic of stunning beauty, words that would be collected into the Quran. The recitation, the message was clear and uncompromising. There is no God but God, Allah, the same God worshipped by Jews and Christians. But the final revelation had come. Muhammad was the seal of the prophets, and humanity must submit, Islam, to the divine will. The Quran spoke of earlier prophets, Abraham and Moses, Jesus, whom it honored as a prophet, though not as divine. It called for social justice, for care of orphans and widows, for the redistribution of wealth through charity, for the dignity of all before God. But in Mecca, where the powerful profited from polytheism and pilgrimage to the Kaaba, this message threatened the established order. Muhammad and his followers faced persecution, ridicule, economic boycott. Finally, in the year 622 of the Common Era, they made the Hijra, the migration to Medina, and this journey became year 1 of the Islamic calendar. the moment when the community of believers established itself as a social and political reality. In Medina, Islam took shape not just as a set of beliefs, but as a complete way of life. The 5 pillars gave structure to practice: the declaration of faith, prayer 5 times daily facing Mecca, charity to the poor, fasting during the month of Ramadan, and pilgrimage to Mecca for those who were able. These were not suggestions, but obligations. The framework within which a Muslim life unfolded, the community grew, and within a decade, Muhammad returned to Mecca in triumph, cleansing the Kaaba of its idols, establishing the city as the spiritual center of Islam. When he died in 632, the question of succession split the community. Those who became Sunni believed the leader should be chosen by the community, while those who became Shia believed leadership should remain in Muhammad's family through his cousin and son-in-law Ali. This division would shape Islamic history, but it did not slow the extraordinary expansion of the faith. Within a century of Muhammad's death, Islamic rule extended from Spain to India. Damascus and Baghdad became centers of a civilization that preserved and extended a Greek philosophy that developed algebra and algorithms, that made advances in medicine and astronomy that Europe would not match for centuries. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad became a golden age of Islamic culture. The House of Wisdom translated texts from Greek and Sanskrit. Scholars like Al-Khwarizmi and Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, made contributions that would influence world thought. Poets crafted verses of exquisite beauty. Architects created spaces where geometry became a form of devotion, where the impossibility of depicting God led to abstract patterns of infinite complexity. Sufism emerged, the mystical dimension of Islam, seeking direct experience of the divine through practices of remembrance, dhikr, and meditation. Rumi in Persia wrote poetry that spoke of divine love with an intensity that transcended doctrinal boundaries. The whirling dervishes spun themselves into states of ecstatic union. Sufi orders spread across the Islamic world, each with its own practices, its own lineages of teachers and students. Meanwhile, far to the east, other developments were unfolding. In India, devotional Hinduism was reaching new heights of expression. The poet saints sang in the vernacular languages, bypassing Sanskrit and the Brahmin priesthood, making the sacred accessible to all. Mirabai wrote of her love for Krishna with such passion that her songs are still sung centuries later. Kabir wove together Hindu and Muslim mystical insights, proclaiming a God beyond all names and forms. Buddhism in India was beginning to decline, absorbed back into the Hindu synthesis that characterized Indian spirituality, but it was flourishing across Asia. In Tibet, it merged with the indigenous Bon religion to create a unique form, Tibetan Buddhism, with its elaborate visualizations, its pantheon of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, its recognition of reincarnated lamas who carried teachings from lifetime to lifetime. The Dalai Lama institution emerged, spiritual and temporal ruler of Tibet, believed to be the incarnation of Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion. Each Dalai Lama was discovered as a child through signs and tests, trained in philosophy and meditation, prepared to guide the Tibetan people. In China, the three teachings, Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, coexisted and interpenetrated. A scholar might be Confucian in his public service, Taoist in his private moments, and Buddhist in his contemplation of mortality. This was not seen as contradiction, but as completeness. Different tools for different aspects of life. In Japan, Buddhism arrived in the 6th century and merged with the indigenous Shinto, the way of the kami, the spirits that inhabited mountains and rivers, trees and waterfalls. The result was a uniquely Japanese spiritual aesthetic, where the Buddha nature could be glimpsed in cherry blossoms, where enlightenment might come through the tea ceremony or the arrangement of flowers, where the transience of all things mono no aware became a path to wisdom. Zen temples created gardens of raked gravel, where patterns suggested water, where stones became mountains, where emptiness was carefully cultivated as a form of fullness. Monks practiced zazen, sitting meditation, for hours, seeking the breakthrough of kensho, the seeing into one's true nature, the koan, paradoxical questions like, what is the sound of one hand clapping, became tools to crack open conceptual thinking, to reveal what lies beneath the surface of rational mind. Christianity, meanwhile, was experiencing its own transformations. The split between Eastern Orthodoxy and Western Catholicism formalized in 1054, though it had been developing for centuries. Language, festus, theology, and politics all played roles. The Orthodox maintained the use of icons, seeing them as windows into the divine, while being careful not to worship the images themselves. The divine liturgy in the Orthodox churches became a participation in heavenly worship, where incense and chant, gold and candlelight created an atmosphere of transcendence. In Western Europe, the Catholic Church became the dominant social institution, providing not just spiritual guidance but education, health care, and social services. The great cathedrals rose, Gothic spires reaching toward heaven, their construction taking generations, whole communities devoting resources to create spaces worthy of encountering the divine. Monasteries like Cluny became centers of reform, attempting to maintain spiritual purity in an age of political corruption. Monks copied manuscripts in scriptoria, their careful calligraphy preserving knowledge through the medieval period. The Benedictine motto, ora et labora, pray and work, shaped a spirituality that saw all labor as potentially sacred, all daily tasks as forms of devotion. Universities emerged from cathedral schools, Paris and Oxford, Bologna and Cambridge, where scholars grappled with questions of faith and reason. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century created a massive synthesis, attempting to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology, arguing that faith and reason were compatible, that both were paths to truth that ultimately converged in God, but this medieval synthesis was already beginning to crack. The Black Death in the 14th century killed perhaps a third of Europe's population, shaking faith in divine providence, raising questions about suffering and justice. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical learning, in human achievement and potential, in the beauty of the physical world. Humanists like Erasmus called for reform, for return to the sources, for Christianity purified of medieval accretions. In 1492, the same year Columbus sailed, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain fell, ending nearly 8 centuries of Islamic presence in Iberia. It had been a complex coexistence, periods of convivencia where Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived alongside one another, translated each other's texts, influenced each other's thought, interspersed with periods of conflict and persecution. The Spanish Inquisition sought religious uniformity. Jews were expelled or forced to convert. Muslims faced the same choice. The purity of blood statutes attempted to root out any trace of Jewish or Muslim ancestry. Even among converts, this intolerance was spreading, but so too were new possibilities. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed 95 theses to a church door, protesting the sale of indulgences, the corruption he saw in the church hierarchy. What began as a call for reform became a revolution. The Protestant Reformation split Western Christianity, asserting that salvation came through faith alone, that Scripture was the ultimate authority, that every believer could approach God directly without priestly mediation. The printing press, recently invented, spread these ideas with unprecedented speed. Suddenly, the Bible could be translated into vernacular languages, printed and distributed, read by ordinary people in their own tongues. The monopoly on interpretation was breaking. Different denominations emerged: Lutheran, Reformed, Anglican, Anabaptist, each with its own understanding of Scripture and practice. The Catholic Church responded with the Counter-Reformation. The Council of Trent reaffirmed traditional doctrine while addressing some abuses. The Jesuits formed a new order dedicated to education and missionary work, bringing an intellectual rigor to the defense of Catholicism. Francis Xavier traveled to India and Japan, Matteo Ricci to China, attempting to present Christianity in forms that resonated with local cultures. In India, the Mughal Emperor Akbar in the 16th century attempted a grand synthesis, inviting scholars from different faiths to his court, creating a new religion, Din-e-Ilahi, that drew from Islam and Hinduism, Zoroastrianism and Jainism. Though it did not survive his death, it represented an impulse toward unity, toward finding the common core beneath different expressions. Sikhism emerged in the Punjab, founded by Guru Nanak in the late 15th century. It rejected the caste system, affirmed the equality of all before God, drew from both Hindu devotional traditions and Islamic monotheism while claiming to transcend both. Of the 10 gurus who followed established practices, the community meal, where all sat together regardless of caste, the final guru, declaring that the scripture itself, the Guru Granth Sahib, would be the eternal guru. The Sikhs developed a martial tradition, defending their faith and community, while maintaining emphasis on meditation and service. Across the world, in ways both violent and peaceful, these traditions were encountering one another. Sometimes the meeting was catastrophic, as when European colonizers brought Christianity to the Americas, to Africa, often destroying indigenous traditions in the process, or when Islam spread through Southeast Asia, sometimes through conquest, sometimes through merchant networks and Sufi teachers, but always, underneath the political and military conflicts, there were individuals seeking truth, communities practicing devotion, mystics touching something beyond words, and the great religions continued to evolve, to adapt, to speak to the deepest human needs in ever-changing contexts. The age of reason and revolution brought new challenges to religious authority. Copernicus and Galileo had already displaced Earth from the center of the cosmos. Now Newton revealed a universe governed by mathematical laws, by forces that operated with clockwork precision. The question arose, was there still room for God in a world explained by science? Some found a middle path, deism, believing in a creator who set the universe in motion but did not intervene in its operation. Others, the atheists and materialists, dispensed with the divine altogether, arguing that matter and energy, cause and effect, were sufficient to explain all phenomena. The French Revolution attempted to replace Christianity with a cult of reason, crowning a dancer as the goddess of reason in Notre Dame's cathedral, though the experiment proved short-lived. Yet even as some intellectuals questioned faith, religious movements were stirring among common people. In England and America, the Methodist revival brought emotional intensity to Protestant practice. John Wesley rode thousands of miles on horseback, preaching to miners and factory workers, to those left behind by the established churches. His emphasis on personal conversion, on the witness of the Holy Spirit in the heart, sparked a movement that spread across the Atlantic. The Great Awakenings in America, first in the 18th century, then again in the 19th, brought waves of religious enthusiasm. Camp meetings lasted for days, with preaching and singing, conversions and ecstatic experiences. New denominations formed, Baptists and Pentecostals, Adventists and holiness movements, each with their own interpretations of Scripture, their own practices and emphases. In India, under British colonial rule, Hinduism was encountering Western ideas and Christian missionary activity. Reform movements emerged. Raja Ram Mohan Roy founded the Brahmo Samaj, attempting to purge Hinduism of what he saw as superstition and social evils like widow burning, while affirming its essential monotheism. Swami Vivekananda brought Hindu philosophy to the West, speaking at the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago in 1893, presenting Vedanta as a universal spirituality that encompassed all religions. The Ramakrishna mission combined meditation and social service, arguing that serving the poor was serving God. This socially engaged Hinduism responded to Christian critiques while maintaining pride in Indian spiritual traditions. Mahatma Gandhi would later develop his philosophy of nonviolent resistance, satyagraha, drawing from Hindu concepts of ahimsa, non-harm, from the Bhagavad Gita's teaching on detachment, from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and from Thoreau's civil disobedience. Buddhism was also experiencing revival and reform in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. Western-educated Buddhists began articulating their tradition in modern terms, emphasizing its rational and empirical aspects, its lack of dependence on a creator God, its compatibility with science. The Theosophical Society, founded by Madame Blavatsky, brought Western seekers to Buddhist teachers, beginning a flow of Dharma transmission that would accelerate in the 20th century. In Japan, the Meiji Restoration brought rapid modernization. The government promoted state Shinto, emphasizing emperor worship and national identity, while Buddhism faced persecution and pressure to adapt. Some Buddhist teachers responded by emphasizing social engagement, by founding new movements that could speak to modern concerns. The seeds were being planted for Buddhism's eventual flourishing in the West. Islam, in the 19th century, faced colonial domination across much of the Muslim world. European powers controlled vast territories from North Africa to South Asia, imposing their laws and economic systems, Promoting Christianity and Western education, Muslim thinkers responded in different ways. Some, the modernists, argued for reinterpretation of Islamic law in light of contemporary needs, for embracing science and democracy while maintaining Islamic identity. Others, like the Wahhabi movement in Arabia, called for a return to what they saw as pure Islam, stripping away centuries of tradition and innovation, rejecting Sufism and saint veneration, insisting on literal interpretation of Quran and Hadith. This tension between modernist and traditionalist, between accommodation and resistance, would shape Islamic thought into the present day. The Ottoman Empire, for centuries the dominant Muslim power, was crumbling. The Caliphate, which had provided at least symbolic unity to Sunni Islam, would be abolished by the secular Turkish Republic in 1924, leaving a vacuum of authority. The colonial period drew arbitrary borders, creating nation-states that often divided ethnic and religious communities, planting seeds of future conflicts. Judaism, too, was transforming. The Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, brought secular education and engagement with European culture. Reform Judaism emerged in Germany, adapting practice to modern life, conducting services in the vernacular, questioning the binding nature of traditional law, emphasizing ethical monotheism over ritual observance. In response, Orthodox Judaism consolidated, defining itself more sharply, while conservative Judaism sought a middle path, maintaining traditional practice while allowing for historical development. And among the Jews of Eastern Europe, Hasidism flourished, emphasizing joy and devotion, the presence of God in all things, the power of the tzaddik, the righteous teacher, to intercede and guide. Zionism arose, the movement for a Jewish homeland, driven partly by persistent anti-Semitism in Europe, partly by a desire to normalize the Jewish people, to become a nation like other nations, rather than a dispersed minority, always vulnerable to persecution. Theodor Herzl organized the first Zionist Congress in 1897, and the long campaign for a Jewish state began. The 20th century brought catastrophes and transformations beyond anything previous generations had imagined. The First World War shattered European confidence, killed millions, destroyed empires. Wilfred Owen wrote bitter poetry about the old lie. Dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori, questioning the religious and patriotic certainties that had sent young men to die in trenches. The Russian Revolution created the first officially atheist state, shutting down churches and mosques, persecuting clergy, promoting scientific materialism as the only acceptable worldview. Yet even under severe repression, faith persisted, going underground, maintained in secret, in kitchens and forests, in whispered prayers and hidden icons. The Holocaust, the Shoah, murdered 6 million Jews, destroying entire communities that had existed for centuries in Europe. The theological crisis was profound. How could a good God allow such evil? Where was divine justice? Some lost faith entirely. Others found it tested but ultimately sustained. Still others developed new theologies, emphasizing human responsibility, questioning old certainties about providence and chosenness. The establishment of Israel in 1948 gave Jews a homeland, but also created new conflicts, displacing Palestinian Arabs, beginning a struggle that continues to this day, intertwining religion and politics in ways that complicate both. After World War II, the colonial empires crumbled. Nations across Asia and Africa gained independence, often defining themselves through religion. India and Pakistan partitioned on religious lines, with terrible violence accompanying the migration of millions. Indonesia became the world's largest Muslim majority nation, maintaining a syncretic culture that blended Islam with older traditions. In America, the post-war period brought religious boom. Church and synagogue attendance soared. New suburban congregations formed. Billy Graham filled stadiums with revival meetings. Norman Vincent Peale preached the power of positive thinking. Catholicism entered the mainstream as John F. Kennedy became the first Catholic president. But change was coming. The Second Vatican Council in the 1960s transformed Catholicism, allowing Mass in vernacular languages, emphasizing engagement with the modern world, promoting interfaith dialogue. The document spoke of other religions containing elements of truth, of the possibility of salvation outside the visible church. This opening would reshape Catholic-Protestant relations, Catholic-Jewish relations, and the Church's engagement with the wider world. The 60s also brought countercultural spirituality. Young people in the West, disillusioned with materialism and conventional religion, turned to Eastern traditions. Maharishi Mahesh. Yogi brought transcendental meditation to celebrities and masses. Buddhist meditation centers opened. Zen became fashionable. The Beatles visited India, and suddenly yoga and mantras entered Western consciousness. Some of this was superficial, spiritual consumerism, picking and choosing elements divorced from their contexts. But some represented genuine seeking, serious practice, deep engagement. Tibetan Buddhism gained Western students when the Chinese invasion of Tibet sent teachers into exile. Thich Nhat Hanh brought Vietnamese Zen and engaged Buddhism, linking meditation to activism for peace and justice. In Iran, the Islamic Revolution of 1979 overthrew the secular Shah, establishing a theocratic state, demonstrating that modernity did not inevitably mean secularization, that religious movements could mobilize masses and reshape politics. The reverberations spread, inspiring Islamic movements across the Muslim world, some peaceful, some militant. Liberation theology emerged in Latin America. Catholic priests and nuns reading the Bible through the lens of the poor, arguing that God stands with the oppressed, that the church must commit itself to social justice. Similar movements arose in other contexts. Black theology in America, feminist theology, queer theology, each reading tradition through the experience of marginalized communities. New religious movements proliferated. Scientology and the Unification Church. ESKCON, bringing Krishna consciousness to the West. Wicca and neo-paganism, reviving pre-Christian practices. The varieties of religious expression seemed to multiply, even as secularization advanced in Western Europe, leaving churches empty, transforming cathedrals into museums. The late 20th century brought both global interconnection and violent fragmentation. The Internet allowed instant communication across traditions. Interfaith dialogue became easier, yet also fundamentalism grew. Across religions, Christian and Muslim and Hindu and Jewish, each tradition producing movements that resisted modernity, that demanded strict adherence, that sometimes turned violent in defense of what they saw as eternal truth. And through it all, in temples and churches, mosques and gurdwaras, In homes and hearts, ordinary people continued to pray, to seek meaning, to mark births and deaths, to gather in community, to pass on traditions to children, to find in these ancient practices something that spoke to contemporary needs, something that connected them to depths beneath the surface of modern life. The great religions had survived empires and revolutions, colonialism and genocide, scientific challenges and secular indifference. They had adapted and evolved, split and reformed, but they persisted, carrying forward the questions and intuitions of countless generations, offering frameworks for meaning in a world that often seemed meaningless, providing community in an age of isolation, pointing toward transcendence in a culture of immanence. And now, as I stand in this quiet place, looking across the vast landscape of human devotion, certain patterns emerge from the particulars, certain themes that thread through the diversity. Each of these traditions, in its own way, grapples with the fundamental mystery of existence. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why does consciousness arise? Why do we suffer and love and die? The answers differ, but the questions are universal, spoken in every language, pondered in every age. There is the perennial question of the relationship between the one and the many. Hinduism speaks of Brahman, the ultimate reality underlying all apparent diversity. Buddhism points to emptiness, sunyata, the lack of inherent existence in all phenomena. Islam proclaims Tawheed, the absolute oneness of God. Judaism declares, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Christianity wrestles with Trinity, three persons in one essence, a mystery that defies simple logic, different formulations, yet perhaps all circling the same deep intuition that beneath the surface multiplicity of experience there is something unified, something whole, or perhaps the opposite, that what we take as solid and separate is actually fluid and interconnected. The mystics of different traditions seem to converge here. Speaking of union, of dissolution of boundaries, of experiencing directly what cannot be adequately described, then there is the question of suffering, its origin and its meaning. The Buddha made it central, the first noble truth. Suffering exists, but every tradition must address it. Judaism, through the story of Job, who demands answers from God and receives not explanation but encounter with mystery. Christianity, through the cross, God entering into suffering, transforming it from within rather than explaining it from without. Islam speaks of tests, of this world as a place of trial where faith is refined. Hinduism and Buddhism offer karma and rebirth, suffering as the result of actions in this life or previous ones, not punishment but consequence. Natural law operating across lifetimes. The problem is framed differently, but each tradition offers resources for enduring, for finding meaning, for not being crushed by the weight of pain. And there is always the tension between transcendence and immanence, between God as wholly other, beyond all human categories, and God as intimately present, closer than breath. Some traditions emphasize the distance, the absolute difference between creator and creation, divine and human. Others stress the continuity, the divine spark within, the possibility of union or realization. Perhaps this too is not contradiction but complementarity, the numinous that Rudolf Otto described, the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the mystery that makes us tremble and draws us in, is both utterly beyond us and somehow deeply familiar. The burning bush that is not consumed, the still small voice after earthquake and fire. These images hold both aspects together. The role of practice varies, but its importance is universal. Whether it is the 5 daily prayers of Islam, the sitting meditation of Zen, the study that is worship in Jewish tradition, the liturgy and sacraments of Christian churches, or the puja offerings of Hindu devotion, every tradition understands that belief alone is insufficient, that we are formed by what we do repeatedly, that practice shapes consciousness, creates habits of attention and intention, and there is always community, sangha, ummah, ecclesia, the gathering of believers who support and challenge one another. Religious life is rarely purely individual. Even hermits in caves were part of traditions, had teachers, drew on communal wisdom. The rituals mark life passages together, celebrate and mourn together, create identity that transcends the isolated self. Yet there is also always the tension between institution and spirit, between the structures that preserve and transmit and the prophetic voices that challenge and renew. Every tradition has its reformers, its mystics who push boundaries, its radicals who call back to original vision. The dialectic between conservation and innovation drives religious evolution. I think of the common ethical core that emerges across traditions. The Golden Rule appears in different forms. Hillel saying, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor." The rest is commentary. Jesus teaching, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." Confucius. Speaking of reciprocity, Shu, the Mahabharata, declaring one should never do to another what one would regard as injurious to oneself. This is not proof that all religions are the same. They are not. The differences matter. But it suggests something about human moral intuition, about the requirements of living together, about what it means to recognize the humanity of the other. Sacred texts hold central place in most traditions. Torah and Talmud, Bible and Quran, Vedas and Upanishads, the Pali Canon and Mahayana Sutras, the Analects and the Tao Te Ching, the Guru Granth Sahib. These are not simply books, but living presences, chanted and memorized, studied and interpreted, sources of authority and inspiration. Their words have been pondered by billions, have shaped civilizations, have brought comfort and challenge across millennia. And always there is the ineffable, that which cannot be captured in words. Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao, the Upanishads, declaring neti neti, not this, not that, pointing beyond all concepts, the negative theology of Christianity, saying what God is not, because what God is exceeds our capacity to name. The Muslim emphasis on God's transcendence, the impossibility of representing the divine in images, this apophatic dimension, this recognition of the limits of language, runs through the contemplative streams of every tradition. It is the cloud of unknowing, the dark night of the soul, the gateless gate, the silence after the words have ended. Yet alongside this recognition of mystery, there is also the affirmation of revelation, of grace, of truth that has been given. The traditions claim not just human seeking, but divine disclosure. God speaking to Abraham and Moses, revealing the Quran to Muhammad, the Tao manifesting in nature, the Buddha awakening to truth that was always there but needed to be seen, Christ as the Word made flesh. And perhaps in this quiet hour, What strikes me most is the sheer variety of ways that human beings have found to be religious. The austerity of a Quaker meeting and the exuberance of Pentecostal worship, the intricate philosophy of Madhyamaka Buddhism and the simple faith of Pure Land devotion, the rigorous law of Orthodox Judaism and the ecstatic poetry of Hasidism, the silence of Zen and the kirtan chanting of Bhakti. All of these are authentic expression, genuine paths, testaments to the diversity of human temperament and culture. The great religions are not monoliths, but rivers with countless tributaries. They contain multitudes, house contradictions, evolve and adapt while claiming continuity with ancient truth. They inspire both profound good and terrible evil, unite and divide, comfort and challenge. Their history is humanity's history, our long wrestling with meaning and mortality, our refusal to accept that the visible world is all there is. And now, as the story turns toward its close, I find myself not with answers, but with deeper questions, with awe at the creativity and courage of religious seeking, with sadness at the violence done in religion's name, with hope that wisdom traditions might guide us through the crises of our age, with gratitude for the beauty and depth they have added to human experience. The air grows cooler, the light softer, and I prepare to step back from this vast landscape, carrying with me images and insights, questions and wonder, knowing I have barely scratched the surface, that lifetimes of study would not exhaust the richness contained in these traditions. But perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the point is not to master or explain, but to witness, to honor, to recognize the sacred search in all its forms, and to hold space for the mystery that draws us forward, always beyond what we currently know, always deeper than our current understanding. The temples and churches grow quiet now. Evening prayers have been offered, candles lit and extinguished. The faithful have returned to their homes, carrying their practices into ordinary life, and the sacred spaces rest, patient, waiting for tomorrow's devotions. I walk slowly down from my imagined hillside, where I could see so far, across centuries and continents. The path winds through darkness now, but it is a comfortable darkness, not emptiness but fullness, pregnant with possibility, rich with all that cannot be seen but only sensed. Somewhere, a bell rings, marking the hour. Its tone carries across distance, pure and clear, then fading into silence. The sound was brief, but something of it lingers, a resonance in the air, in the heart, a reminder that vibration continues even after we can no longer hear. The great religions are like that bell, their origins lost in the mists of time, their current expressions clear and present, their future unknown. But the resonance, the echo of humanity's encounter with the sacred, that continues, passed from generation to generation, adapted and renewed, never quite the same, never entirely different. And I am grateful to have listened, to have traced these paths, to have sat for a while with the questions that have occupied our species since we first looked up at stars and wondered, since we first buried our dead with ceremony, since we first gathered to tell stories of meaning in the face of chaos. The wondering continues. The seeking goes on in 10,000 forms, in languages living and dead, in practices ancient and new. This is what it means to be human, to ask what it all means, to reach toward something beyond ourselves, to create meaning even while acknowledging mystery. The night settles in. complete now, and in the darkness I can still sense the presence of all those seeking souls, the billions who have walked these paths before, the millions walking them now, the countless generations yet to come, all of us together, searching, finding, losing, and finding again, the endless human dialogue with transcendence, and slowly, like breath releasing, like tension easing, like snow settling softly on already silent ground, the thoughts grow quieter, the images fade, and what remains is simply this: the deep stillness after the story, the pause after the final word, the space where nothing needs to be said, because everything essential has been spoken, or perhaps because the essential cannot be spoken at all, only lived, only experienced, only known in the wordless knowing that comes when we finally, gently let go. There are moments when the world feels very large and very quiet, and it's in those moments that I find myself looking upward into the vastness that stretches beyond the air we breathe, beyond the clouds that drift and dissolve, into the realm where metal and mathematics dance together in perfect silence. Tonight, my thoughts have wandered to those patient travelers, the ones that circle endlessly above us, tracing invisible paths through the darkness, moving with a precision that would seem impossible if we couldn't measure it, if we couldn't prove it with numbers and trajectories and the faint signals they send earthward like whispered secrets. Satellites. The word itself seems to float, suspended between the technical and the poetic, between human ambition and celestial mechanics. They move through a darkness so complete that it redefines what darkness means, yet they are never truly lost, never wandering, each one following laws written in the language of gravity and velocity, in the mathematics of orbital mechanics that Johann Kepler began to decipher centuries before any human-made object could test his predictions. I imagine them now, hundreds of them, thousands, some no larger than a shoebox, others the size of a school bus, each one wrapped in its own particular silence, carrying instruments that measure, mirrors that reflect, antennas that listen and transmit, solar panels spread like wings catching photons that have traveled 93 million miles only to be converted into electricity in the coldest environment imaginable. The sky tonight might appear empty to the casual glance, but it is crowded with these silent witnesses. They occupy different neighborhoods in the vertical city of space, some skimming just above the atmosphere's edge, feeling the last whispers of atmospheric drag, completing their circuits of Earth in a mere 90 minutes, racing over continents and oceans with an urgency that comes from being so close to the planet's embrace. Others have climbed much higher, to altitudes where the air is not even a memory, where they can pause in their orbits, matching Earth's rotation so perfectly that they seem to hover, eternally stationed above one patch of ground, watching the same hemisphere turn through day and night, through seasons and storms, becoming fixed points in a universe of motion, and still others have ventured farther into elliptical paths that carry them swooping close and then swinging far, or into polar orbits that take them over the tops and bottoms of the world, seeing the ice caps and the auroras, crossing the terminator line between day and night again and again, their instruments drinking in data about magnetic fields and particle radiation and the subtle ways our planet breathes and shifts, Each satellite carries with it a story of human curiosity, of engineers who calculated and recalculated, of metallurgists who chose materials that could withstand temperature swings from scorching sunlight to absolute shadow, of programmers who wrote code to govern systems that would receive no maintenance, no repairs, no second chances once the rocket's final stage fell away and left them climbing toward their designated altitude. The mathematics alone, the sheer weight of calculation required to place something in orbit, speaks to a particular kind of faith in numbers, in physics, in the predictability of nature's laws. A satellite must achieve a very specific velocity, not too fast, or it will escape Earth's gravity entirely, not too slow, or it will succumb to that same gravity and fall, but precisely balanced so that it falls around Earth rather than into it, perpetually falling in a circle or an ellipse, tracing the same path again and again with a regularity that clocks can measure. I find something deeply calming in that regularity, in knowing that while everything else changes, while cities grow and forests shrink, while coastlines shift and ice melts, these objects continue their silent rounds, indifferent to politics and weather, to human joy and human sorrow, guided only by the mathematics that govern all falling things, from raindrops to planets. The first of them climbed into the darkness decades ago, when spaceflight itself was barely more than a dream made suddenly real, and since then their numbers have grown, their purposes have multiplied, but the essential truth remains unchanged. They are visitors to a realm that exists just beyond our immediate reach, close enough to still feel Earth's pull, far enough to see the whole sphere of our world at once, to perceive the thin blue line of atmosphere that makes all life possible, to witness the planet as a complete thing, a marble, a home, suspended in an ocean of space that stretches in all directions without end. And so, to understand these silent travelers, we must return to a time when the very idea seemed impossible, when the notion of placing an object in orbit belonged only to dreamers and writers of fiction, to those who could imagine beyond the constraints of the present moment. The story begins not with metal and rockets, but with ideas, with minds that looked at the moon and wondered, with mathematicians who understood that an orbit was simply a special kind of fall. Isaac Newton himself had conceived of it. In his thought experiment about a cannon on a mountaintop, firing a cannonball with such tremendous speed that it would never hit the ground, but would instead fall around the curve of Earth perpetually, forever. But conceiving and achieving are separated by centuries of engineering, by the development of materials and fuels, by the slow accumulation of knowledge about what happens when you push metal to extraordinary speeds through increasingly thin air. The true beginning, the moment when satellite became more than theory, arrived in the middle years of the 20th century, when two nations, locked in competition and suspicion, turned their attention skyward, each determined to demonstrate superiority not through earthbound conquest, but through the mastery of space itself. The Soviet Union moved first in 1957 on the 4th day of October, when they launched a sphere of polished metal into the autumn sky. Sputnik, meaning traveler or fellow traveler, a name that captured both motion and companionship, as if this metal ball might befriend humanity in its journey around the sun. It weighed 83.6 kilograms, about 184 pounds, small enough that a person could carry it, yet heavy enough to require an enormous rocket to lift it beyond the atmosphere. The sphere measured 58 centimeters across, roughly 23 inches, and from it extended 4 whip-like antennas ranging from 2.4 to 2.9 meters in length, antennae that would broadcast a simple radio signal, a beep that could be heard by anyone with the right equipment. That signal, transmitted on frequencies of 20.005 and 40.002 megahertz, became the voice of a new era, a rhythmic pulse, beep, 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 crossing continents and oceans, announcing that humanity had placed something beyond the air, something that would not fall back immediately, but would continue, orbiting, circling, completing one revolution every 96.2 minutes. The world listened. Amateur radio operators turned their antennas skyward, tracking the signal as it passed overhead. People gathered in backyards and on rooftops, straining to glimpse a moving point of light against the stars, though what they often saw was not Sputnik itself, but the rocket's upper stage, which also achieved orbit, tumbling along behind its payload like a dutiful servant. The orbit itself told a story in numbers. At its nearest point to Earth, the perigee, Sputnik descended to 215 kilometers, about 134 miles above the surface. At its farthest point, the apogee, it climbed to 939 kilometers, roughly 583 miles, tracing an elliptical path that leaned at an angle of 65.1 degrees to the equator. For 22 days, the batteries lasted and the beeping continued, and then silence, though the satellite itself kept falling around Earth, kept orbiting for 3 months total, 92 days, completing roughly 1,400 orbits before atmospheric drag finally claimed it, pulling it down, until friction with the thickening air transformed it into a brief streak of light, a meteor of human making. But in those 92 days, everything had changed. The possibility had become actual. The theoretical had manifested in metal and mathematics, and the race truly began. 1 month later, in November of that same year, Sputnik. 2 ascended, larger, heavier, carrying within its payload a passenger, a dog named Laika, a stray from the streets of Moscow, chosen and trained for a journey she could not understand. She became the first living creature to orbit Earth. Her heartbeat and vital signs transmitted down to receiving stations, proving that biology could survive the acceleration, the weightlessness, the radiation beyond Earth's protective atmosphere. The ethics of that mission, sending a creature with no return plan, no possibility of recovery, would be debated for decades, but the technical achievement remained undeniable. Life could exist in orbit, at least temporarily, at least long enough to gather data about how a mammalian body responded to conditions never before experienced in millions of years of evolution. The United States, watching, calculating, rushed to respond. Their first attempt, in December of 1957, ended in fire and frustration when the Vanguard rocket exploded on the launch pad, a very public failure broadcast to a watching world, but persistence, engineering refinement led to success. On the first day of February in 1958, Explorer 1 climbed into the sky atop a Jupiter C rocket, a modified Redstone ballistic missile. The satellite itself weighed only 13.97 kilograms, about 30.8 pounds, much lighter than Sputnik, a slender cylinder barely 2.03 meters long and 15.2 centimeters in diameter, narrow, efficient, carrying instruments designed by James Van Allen, a physicist whose name would soon be attached to a fundamental discovery. Explorer 1 carried cosmic ray detectors, Geiger counters that measured radiation, and as it orbited, climbing to a perigee of 360 kilometers and an apogee of 2,550 kilometers, those instruments detected something unexpected, something profound. Zones of intense radiation trapped by Earth's magnetic field, belts of charged particles, electrons and protons captured and held in invisible magnetic bottles stretching around the planet. These Van Allen belts, as they came to be known, represented the first major scientific discovery of the space age, proof that satellites were not merely demonstrations of engineering prowess, but platforms for learning, for seeing Earth and its environment in ways impossible from the ground, where atmosphere and magnetic field merge and blur, making certain measurements difficult or impossible. Through 1958 and 59, more satellites ascended, each one teaching its creators something new about design, about power systems, about the challenges of the space environment. Vanguard 1, launched in March of 1958, became the oldest satellite still in orbit, its batteries long dead, but its polished sphere still catching sunlight, still obeying the mathematics of its trajectory, expected to remain a law for perhaps 200 years or more. The Soviets continued their series. Sputnik 3, a massive laboratory weighing 1,327 kilograms, carrying a dozen scientific instruments, though a tape recorder failure meant much of its data was lost, capturing information that could not be transmitted in real time and could not be stored for later playback. Each launch refined the understanding of what worked and what failed. Solar panels proved more reliable than batteries for long-duration missions. The space environment corroded certain materials, temperature extremes, from 120 degrees Celsius in direct sunlight to minus 150 degrees Celsius in Earth's shadow, required careful engineering, thermal blankets, reflective surfaces, systems that could radiate excess heat or retain necessary warmth. And the tracking networks grew. Ground stations spread across continents, each one with antennas pointed skyward, calculating orbits from Doppler shifts in radio signals, from precise timing measurements, building catalogs of objects, predicting when each satellite would pass overhead, when line-of-sight communication windows would open and close. The early satellites were simple. By necessity, they carried basic instruments, they broadcast simple signals, they proved concepts, but they established the foundation, the understanding that orbits were achievable, sustainable, useful. They demonstrated that the tyranny of the rocket equation, which demanded that most of a rocket's mass be fuel, could be overcome with sufficient engineering and determination. By 1960, dozens of satellites circled Earth, American and Soviet, each one a laboratory, a test bed, a proof of principle, and the purposes began to diversify. Tyro-as 1, launched in April of 1960, became the first successful weather satellite, carrying television cameras that looked down at cloud patterns, at storm systems, providing a view from above that meteorologists had only dreamed of. The first image it transmitted, showing a sweep of clouds over the northern hemisphere, revealed weather as a planetary phenomenon, patterns spanning thousands of miles, visible only from this new perspective. Communication satellites emerged. Echo 1 launched in August of 1960, a large balloon, 30.5 meters in diameter, when inflated in orbit, coated with aluminum, serving as a passive reflector for radio signals. A signal beamed from one ground station would bounce off Echo's surface and could be received elsewhere, demonstrating that space could serve as a relay point, a mirror in the sky, though passive systems proved less efficient than active repeaters would soon become. And reconnaissance satellites, though their existence was classified, their purposes obscured, began their silent watch, carrying cameras with resolution sufficient to identify objects on the ground, providing intelligence that could be gathered without violating airspace, without risking pilots. The details of these early spy satellites would remain secret for decades, but their influence on policy and strategy was immediate and profound. The 1960s unfolded, and with each passing year, the populations in orbit grew denser, more specialized, more ambitious in their designs and purposes. What had begun as simple spheres broadcasting beeps evolved into sophisticated platforms, each one engineered for a specific task, a particular measurement, a defined role in the expanding infrastructure of space. Telstar 1 arrived in July of 1962, a collaboration between AT&T and Bell Laboratories, and it changed everything about communication. This was no passive reflector like Echo, but an active repeater, receiving signals beamed up from Earth, amplifying them with onboard electronics powered by solar cells, and retransmitting them back down to a different location. For the first time, live television crossed the Atlantic. Images captured in the United States appeared on screens in Europe with only a fraction of a second delay, the time it took for radio waves to climb to the satellite and descend again. The orbit was elliptical, ranging from 952 kilometers at perigee to 5,633 kilometers at apogee, completing one revolution every 2 hours and 37 minutes. This meant Telstar was only visible from both continents simultaneously for brief windows, 20 minutes or so, per orbit, requiring careful scheduling, precise coordination between ground stations in Andover, Maine, Goonhilly Downs in England, and Plumeur-Bodou in France. Those ground stations themselves were marvels, enormous horn antennas, the one in Andover weighing 340 tons, able to track the satellite as it arced across the sky. Adjusting constantly to maintain the connection, the engineers had to account for Doppler shift, the way the satellite's motion changed the frequency of signals, stretching them as it moved away, compressing them as it approached, like the changing pitch of a passing train's whistle, but measured in megahertz rather than musical notes. And there was another challenge, unexpected, discovered only after launch. The radiation environment of space proved harsher than anticipated, particularly after high-altitude nuclear tests conducted by both the United States and Soviet Union had temporarily intensified the Van Allen belts, filling them with additional charged particles. Telstar's transistors began to fail, degraded by radiation damage, and though engineers could command the satellite to switch to backup systems, the incident drove home a crucial lesson. Space was not empty, not benign, but filled with invisible hazards that could destroy electronics over time. The solution, for communications satellites lay in going higher, much higher, to an altitude of 35,786 kilometers above the equator, where the orbital period matched Earth's rotation exactly, 24 hours, creating what appeared from the ground to be a stationary platform, hovering eternally over one spot. This geostationary orbit, predicted decades earlier by science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke, became the foundation of global telecommunications. SYNCOM-2, launched in July of 1963, achieved the first successful geosynchronous orbit, followed by SYNCOM-3 in August of 1964, positioned over the Pacific Ocean, just in time to relay coverage of the Tokyo Olympics, broadcasting images across vast distances, making global events truly global in their viewership. The mathematics of geostationary orbit were elegant and unforgiving, too high, and the satellite would drift away from Earth, too low, and it would lap the planet's rotation, appearing to slide westward across the sky. The altitude had to be precise, and the orbit had to lie exactly above the equator. Any inclination, any tilt, north or south, would cause the satellite to trace a figure-8 pattern in the sky, rising and falling in latitude even as it maintained its longitude. Station keeping, the process of maintaining this precise position, required periodic thruster firings, tiny adjustments to counteract the gravitational influences of the moon and sun, which constantly perturbed the orbit, pulling satellites slightly eastward or westward, slightly northward or southward. Each adjustment consumed propellant, and when the propellant was exhausted, the satellite would begin to drift, eventually moving into a graveyard orbit, slightly higher, where it would not interfere with operational spacecraft. Weather satellites matured rapidly through this era. The Tyros series gave way to ESA, the Environmental Science Services Administration satellites, and then to the NOAA series, each generation carrying better cameras, more sophisticated sensors, expanding from visible light imagery to infrared, allowing meteorologists to see cloud formations at night, to measure sea surface temperatures, to track hurricanes from birth to dissipation. Nimbus satellites, a parallel series focused on research rather than operational forecasting, carried instruments that measured atmospheric composition, temperature profiles at different altitudes, radiation budgets, how much energy Earth absorbed from the sun versus how much it radiated back to space. These measurements, accumulated over years, began to reveal patterns, trends, subtle changes in atmospheric chemistry and temperature that would later inform understanding of climate change. The imagery itself, grainy and crude by later standards, nonetheless transformed meteorology from a local science to a global one. Forecasters could see entire storm systems, could watch weather patterns develop over oceans where no ground-based observations existed, could track the jet stream's meandering path. The view from above revealed that weather was not a collection of isolated phenomena, but a connected system, air masses flowing, interacting, governed by pressure gradients and the Coriolis effect. The apparent deflection caused by Earth's rotation, navigation satellites emerged, addressing a problem as old as seafaring, determining position without reference to landmarks, on the Navy Navigation Satellite System, also known as Transit, became operational in 1964. offering ships the ability to fix their position by measuring Doppler shifts in signals from passing satellites. The satellites orbited in a polar constellation crisscrossing the globe, ensuring that at least one would pass overhead every few hours at any location. A ship would receive signals from a transit satellite, measuring how the frequency changed as the satellite approached, passed overhead, and receded, combined with precise knowledge of the satellite's orbit, broadcast in the signal itself, and precise timekeeping. These measurements could determine latitude and longitude to within 200 meters, revolutionary accuracy for the era, though requiring patience, waiting for a satellite pass, remaining relatively stationary during the measurement. Military applications, though often classified, drove much of the innovation. Reconnaissance satellites grew more capable. Film return systems, code-named Corona and Gambit, carried high-resolution cameras and physical film, which would be loaded into re-entry capsules ejected from orbit, caught in mid-air by aircraft trailing specialized equipment. The resolution improved from being able to identify large buildings to being able to count individual vehicles, to reading markings on aircraft, to detecting objects as small as 30 centimeters across. These satellites flew lower than most, at altitudes of 150 to 300 kilometers, where atmospheric drag was significant, limiting mission lifetimes to days or weeks, but allowing closer views, sharper images. They would orbit, photographing targets of interest, and then return their film before atmospheric drag brought them down. The entire satellite was often expendable, designed for a single mission. Unlike the long-duration platforms being developed for other purposes, electronic intelligence satellites, listening satellites, began populating different orbits designed to intercept radio communications, radar signals, telemetry from missile tests. They carried large antennas, sensitive receivers, and increasingly sophisticated recording systems, building a library of signals, patterns, helping analysts understand what adversaries were doing, what capabilities they possessed, where facilities were located. The Soviet Union pursued parallel paths. Their Molniya satellites, launched beginning in 1965, addressed a unique challenge: geostationary orbit, positioned above the equator, provided poor coverage of high latitudes of Soviet territory stretching across northern Asia. The solution was a highly elliptical orbit, inclined at 63.4 degrees, with a 12-hour period, spending most of each orbit high above the northern hemisphere, appearing to hover for long periods despite not being geostationary. A constellation of satellites in Molniya orbits, staggered in their phases, could provide continuous coverage of high latitudes. Scientific satellites pushed into new territories of measurement. Explorer 35, launched in July of 1967, entered orbit around the Moon, studying the lunar environment, magnetic fields, solar wind interactions, OGO, orbiting geophysical observatory satellites, massive platforms weighing hundreds of kilograms, carry dozens of instruments measuring particle radiation, magnetic fields, solar emissions, building a comprehensive picture of near-Earth space, the region where Earth's magnetic field interacts with the solar wind, creating a bow shock, a magnetopause, regions with names like the plasma sphere and magnetotail. And through all of this expansion, this proliferation of satellites, each one represented choices, engineering choices about power systems, whether to use solar panels or radioisotope thermoelectric generators, which converted heat from decaying plutonium into electricity, offering power in deep space or in shadowed orbits where sunlight was unavailable. Design choices about redundancy, whether to include backup systems, duplicate components, knowing that repair was impossible, that once launched, a satellite was on its own. Orbital mechanics dictated lifetimes. Low orbits meant faster decay due to atmospheric drag, but allowed closer observation. Higher orbits offered longevity, but required more energy to reach. Polar orbits provided global coverage, passing over every point on Earth as the planet rotated beneath, but demanded more propellant for launch compared to equatorial orbits, which could take advantage of Earth's rotational velocity. The debris began accumulating too. Spent rocket stages tumbled alongside functional satellites, paint flakes, fragments from exploded batteries, pieces from deliberate anti-satellite tests, all becoming permanent residents of orbital space, each fragment obeying the same mathematical laws as functional spacecraft, orbiting, occasionally colliding, creating more fragments in a cascade that would only grow worse with time. By the time the 1970s arrived, satellites had become infrastructure, woven into the fabric of daily life in ways most people never considered. Weather forecasts relied on imagery from orbit. International phone calls bounced through geostationary repeaters. Ships navigated using transit. Military planners studied reconnaissance images, and scientists analyzed data streams from instruments circling Earth and venturing beyond. Landsat-1, launched in July of 1972, opened new dimensions of observation. This was not a weather satellite watching clouds, but an Earth resources satellite, carrying multispectral scanners that measured reflected light in different wavelengths, visible and infrared, seeing not just what things looked like, but revealing their composition, their condition. Healthy vegetation reflected infrared strongly, stressed crops less so, urban areas, water bodies, geological formations, each had distinctive spectral signatures. The images arrived as digital data, not photographs, arrays of numbers representing brightness in different bands, which could be combined and processed. False color images where vegetation appeared red, water black, cities blue-gray. Geologists used Landsat to map mineral deposits, identify geological structures. Agronomists estimated crop yields across entire regions. Urban planners tracked city growth. Foresters monitored deforestation. The view from orbit, repeated every 18 days as Landsat traced its sun-synchronous path, created a record of planetary change, a baseline against which future observations could be compared. Sun-synchronous orbits themselves represented elegant orbital design. These were polar orbits with a specific altitude and inclination, chosen so that Earth's equatorial bulge, its slight oblate shape, caused the orbital plane to precess, to rotate at exactly the rate needed to keep pace with the sun. The satellite would cross the equator at the same local time on every pass, ensuring consistent lighting conditions, shadows falling at the same angles, making comparisons between images meaningful. GPS, the Global Positioning System, began its slow development during this era, though it would not reach full operational capability until the 1990s. The concept was ambitious, a constellation of satellites broadcasting precise timing signals, a receiver on the ground, measuring the arrival time of signals from multiple satellites, could determine its distance from each one, and triangulate its position. The precision required was extraordinary. Timing errors of even a microsecond would translate to position errors of 300 meters, so each satellite carried atomic clocks, accurate to nanoseconds, and broadcast orbital parameters constantly updated by ground stations. The orbits were carefully designed, 20,180 kilometers altitude, far above the radiation belts, in a medium Earth orbit that provided a 12-hour period. The constellation was arranged in 6 orbital planes, each inclined at 55 degrees, ensuring that at least 4 satellites were visible from any point on Earth at any time, providing the minimum needed for a 3-dimensional position, fix, latitude, longitude, and altitude. Communication satellites proliferated, no longer experimental. They became commercial ventures. Intelsat, the International Telecommunications Satellite Organization, operated a growing fleet of geostationary satellites, each generation larger and more capable than the last. Intelsat 1, nicknamed Early Bird, launched in 1965, could handle 240 telephone circuits or 1 television channel. By the time Intelsat 5 launched in 1980, capacity had grown to 12,000 telephone circuits and 2 television channels simultaneously. The satellites themselves became more sophisticated. 3-axis stabilization replaced spin stabilization, allowing large solar panels to remain pointed at the sun while antennas pointed continuously at Earth. Transponders, the receiver amplifier transmitter systems at the heart of communication satellites, increased in number and power. Spot beams, narrow antenna patterns focused on specific regions, allowed frequency reuse, the same frequencies serving different geographic areas without interference. And yet, for all this growth, all this capability, the fundamental challenge remained unchanged. Everything placed in orbit had to be lifted there against Earth's gravity, requiring rockets, most of which were expendable, used once and discarded. The economics were brutal, launch costs measured in thousands of dollars per kilogram, making every gram of satellite mass a costly investment. The Space Shuttle, introduced in 1981, promised to change this equation. A reusable spacecraft that could carry satellites to orbit, deploy them, and return to Earth to fly again. The cargo bay could accommodate large satellites, and astronauts could perform tasks in orbit that robots could not. But the promise of routine, low-cost access to space proved elusive. Turnaround between flights took months, not weeks, and the cost per launch, when all factors were accounted for, remained high. Still, the shuttle enabled certain missions impossible with expendable rockets. It deployed the Hubble Space Telescope in April of 1990, a satellite unlike any other, carrying a mirror 2.4 meters in diameter, designed to observe the universe in visible, ultraviolet, and near-infrared light, free from the blurring and absorption caused by Earth's atmosphere. Though famously flawed at first, a spherical aberration in the primary mirror caused by a testing error, the shuttle's ability to return to orbit and install corrective optics in December of 1993 transformed Hubble into the most productive astronomical observatory ever built. Hubble's orbit, 540 kilometers high, required periodic reboosts to counteract atmospheric drag, and servicing missions brought new instruments, upgraded systems, extending its operational life far beyond the original 15-year design. Each servicing mission, astronauts working in space suits to remove and replace components the size of telephone booths, demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of human presence in orbit. Military satellites continued their evolution largely hidden from public view. The Defense Support Program satellites, massive platforms in geostationary orbit, watched for the infrared signatures of missile launches. Their telescopes stared down at Earth continuously, sensitive enough to detect the heat plume of a rising rocket within seconds, providing early warning that gave decision-makers crucial minutes. The KH-11 series reconnaissance satellites, sometimes called Keyhole, carried telescopes as large as Hubble's but pointed downward, their capabilities classified but hinted at in occasional declassified images showing remarkable detail. The Soviet Union, and later Russia, maintained parallel constellations. Their Cosmos series numbered over 2,000 satellites by the year 2000, covering reconnaissance, navigation, communication, scientific research, though less capable in some respects than Western counterparts. Soviet satellites often employed different design philosophies, shorter-lived but more numerous, optimized for mass production rather than longevity. Weather satellites advanced to geostationary orbits, GOES, geostationary operational environmental satellites, positioned above the Americas, provided continuous monitoring. Their imagers scanned Earth's disk every 15 to 30 minutes, tracking storm development in real time. Meteorologists could watch hurricanes evolve, see thunderstorm complexes organize and dissipate, monitor the movement of atmospheric rivers, long plumes of moisture flowing from tropics to mid-latitudes. The data streams grew richer. Sounders measured temperature and humidity profiles through the depth of the atmosphere. Lightning mappers detected electrical discharges. Solar instruments monitored the sun's output, its eruptions and flares that could affect satellite electronics and radio communications. The satellites became platforms for understanding Earth as a system, atmosphere, ocean, land, biosphere, all interacting, all visible from this unique vantage point, and quietly, almost unnoticed except by specialists. Satellites began revealing environmental changes. Measurements of ozone concentration in the stratosphere, made by instruments on Nimbus 7 and later satellites, showed a disturbing pattern, a seasonal thinning over Antarctica, a hole in the ozone layer caused by chlorofluorocarbons released by human activity. The discovery, confirmed by ground-based measurements, led to the Montreal Protocol, an international agreement to phase out ozone-depleting substances. It was one of the first times satellite data directly drove global environmental policy. Ice monitoring satellites, using radar altimeters and other instruments, began measuring the thickness and extent of polar ice. The data accumulated year by year, creating records that would later show ice sheets losing mass, glaciers retreating, sea ice diminishing in extent and thickness. The satellites measured what could not be easily measured from the ground, the vast ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, the sea ice covering millions of square kilometers, providing evidence of planetary change that would have been invisible without this orbital perspective. By the 1990s, the population in orbit had grown to thousands of active satellites, plus tens of thousands of tracked debris objects. The space around Earth had become crowded, particularly in certain valuable orbits. Low Earth orbit between 400 and 600 kilometers held many satellites. Sun-synchronous orbits at similar altitudes attracted Earth observation platforms. Geostationary orbit, a thin ring 35,000 kilometers up, hosted hundreds of satellites, each requiring careful positioning to avoid interference with neighbors. International cooperation expanded. The International Space Station, assembled beginning in 1998, became the largest satellite ever built, though calling it simply a satellite understates its complexity. A crewed laboratory orbiting at 400 kilometers altitude, hosting astronauts and cosmonauts continuously, conducting research impossible on Earth's surface, studying how materials behave in microgravity, how flames burn without convection, how plants grow without a defined up or down. Commercial space began its slow emergence. Companies launched constellations for communication, for Earth imaging, for internet connectivity. The business models evolved from pure government funding to mixed public-private partnerships to fully commercial ventures. Launch costs began to decline as new providers entered the market, as reusable rockets, pioneered by SpaceX with the Falcon 9, demonstrated economic viability. And through all these decades, through all this evolution, the fundamental truth persisted. Satellites were machines in an unforgiving environment subject to radiation, micrometeorite impacts, thermal stress, vacuum welding, atomic oxygen erosion in low orbits. They had no atmosphere to moderate temperature extremes, no protection from charged particles accelerated by solar storms, no possibility of repair except for the rare few visited by astronauts. Each satellite represented a crystallized moment of human knowledge and capability. The technologies incorporated, the materials chosen, the software written, all reflected what was possible, what was understood. At the moment of launch, and once in orbit, they could not easily adapt to new discoveries, new needs. They were frozen, operating according to designs made years earlier, carrying out missions planned before their rockets ignited. Yet they endured. Many satellites operated far beyond their design lifetimes. Components proved more robust than specifications required. Engineers had built-in margins, redundancies, backups for backups, and in the benign environment of space with no weather, no corrosion from moisture, no vibration except what the satellite itself generated, systems could function for decades if power held out and critical components did not fail. And so we arrive at something profound, something that reveals itself only when we step back and consider the whole. This population of machines circling endlessly above us, each one a testament not just to engineering, but to a particular way of seeing, of thinking, of understanding our place in the cosmos. There is something almost meditative in the precision required, the calculations and that must account for every force, every perturbation, the gravitational pull of the moon tugging at satellites, the sun's radiation pressure pushing against solar panels like wind against a sail, the subtle asymmetries in Earth's gravitational field, the planet not being a perfect sphere but slightly pear-shaped, with mass concentrations, mascons, beneath the surface that create gravitational anomalies. Orbital mechanics becomes a kind of poetry written in mathematics. Hohmann transfer orbits, the most fuel-efficient path between two circular orbits, describe graceful ellipses that kiss both circles at their endpoints. Gravity assists, using a planet's motion to accelerate or decelerate a spacecraft. Transform gravitational fields into stepping stones, allowing missions to reach destinations that would otherwise be impossible with available propellant. The satellites themselves, these silent machines, see things we cannot. They measure in wavelengths invisible to human eyes, microwave radiation penetrating clouds to map surface topography, infrared revealing heat signatures, ultraviolet detecting atmospheric chemistry. They perceive the planet as fields and gradations, magnetic field lines mapping Earth's protective cocoon, gravitational variations revealing mass distribution, electrical phenomena in the upper atmosphere creating glows and flashes, and there is something humbling in realizing how much remains hidden without them. Before satellites, hurricanes over open ocean could strike coastlines with little warning. Entire weather systems developed and dissipated unknown except to the ships that encountered them, the extent of Antarctic ice, the height of Himalayan peaks, the deforestation of Amazon rainforests, all were imprecisely known, estimated, debated. Now we measure, we quantify, we track changes year by year, season by season. Satellites record the greening of spring as it sweeps northward across continents, the retreat of sea ice each summer and its expansion each winter, the rise of sea level measured in millimeters per year, accumulating to centimeters per decade. The patient accumulation of data reveals patterns that unfold too slowly for human perception, changes visible only when measurements span years, decades. The very notion of a global perspective, of Earth as a unified system, owes much to this orbital vantage point. The famous images, the blue marble photograph taken by Apollo 17 astronauts, Earthrise seen from lunar orbit. These were not from satellites, but from human missions beyond Earth orbit. Yet they awakened something, a recognition that the planet is bounded, finite, a closed system floating in vacuum. Satellites reinforce this understanding because their instruments measure inputs and outputs, solar radiation arriving, terrestrial radiation departing, the energy balance that determines climate, the carbon cycle that moves atoms between atmosphere, ocean, biosphere, rock, the water cycle that lifts moisture from oceans and deposits it as rain and snow, all become visible as interconnected flows, as systems that can be modeled, predicted, understood in new ways. And yet, for all this capability, all this reach, satellites remain fundamentally limited. They see surfaces, not depths. They detect what radiates or reflects, not what lies hidden beneath ocean waves or soil. They measure what changes rapidly enough to be detected, not the slow creep of geological processes. They are tools, immensely capable tools, but still bound by the physics of their sensors, the resolution of their optics, the sensitivity of their receivers. There is also fragility here, rarely acknowledged. The satellites depend on ground infrastructure, tracking stations, command centers, personnel monitoring telemetry, analyzing data. A satellite cut off from ground contact becomes orphaned, unable to receive new instructions, limited to executing whatever autonomous programming it carries. Some satellites, the old ones, lacked sophisticated onboard computers, required constant guidance from Earth, while newer platforms, more autonomous, could still operate for days or weeks without contact. They too eventually need human intervention, and the orbits themselves, though stable for years or decades, are not permanent. Low Earth orbit satellites constantly battle atmospheric drag. Thin wisps of air at 400 kilometers altitude, thinner still at 600, but present nonetheless. Each passage through the atmosphere, even at these altitudes, creates friction, robs energy, lowers the orbit slightly, without periodic reboosts, without thrusters firing to restore altitude. Even the International Space Station would eventually spiral down, would fall, would burn. Higher satellites in geostationary orbit face different threats. The gravitational influence of moon and sun perturbs their positions. Radiation gradually degrades solar panels, reducing power generation. Electronic components accumulate damage from high-energy particles, eventually failing. When a geostationary satellite reaches end of life, when its propellant is exhausted or its systems fail, operators command it higher into graveyard orbit, a few hundred kilometers above the operational belt, where it will drift harmlessly, a derelict for millennia. The question of sustainability, of whether this expansion can continue, grows more pressing with each launch. The debris field expands. Collisions create fragments. Each fragment becomes a potential projectile, orbiting at kilometers per second, carrying kinetic energy enough to damage or destroy whatever it strikes. The Kessler syndrome, predicted by NASA scientist Donald Kessler, describes a cascade where collisions create debris that causes more collisions, exponentially increasing the debris population until certain orbital regions become unusable. Mitigation efforts, international guidelines, call for satellites to be designed for deorbiting at end of life, either burning up during atmospheric re-entry or moving to graveyard orbits. But compliance is voluntary, and many older satellites, launched before these concerns were recognized, remain in orbit with no means of removal. We have littered the space around our planet, perhaps not irreparably, but significantly, creating hazards that will persist for decades or centuries. Yet even acknowledging these challenges, these limitations, the achievement remains extraordinary. We have extended human perception into a realm we cannot directly inhabit for more than brief periods. We have created systems that operate autonomously for years, that measure and record and transmit, that maintain their orbits and orientations, that harvest energy from sunlight and store it in batteries, that perform their designed functions with remarkable reliability despite operating in vacuum, in radiation, in temperature extremes. And now, as thoughts drift toward conclusion, toward the gentle closing of this contemplation, I find myself returning to the essential wonder, the quiet astonishment that never quite fades, that we have done this, that we continue to do this, that above us now, this very moment, thousands of machines trace their invisible paths. Some are the size of refrigerators, some larger than buses. They carry names we might recognize. Hubble, the International Space Station, GPS satellites that millions use daily without thought. And they carry names we have never heard, obscure designations, catalog numbers, satellites serving purposes known only to their operators, performing measurements that contribute to knowledge in ways both immediate and subtle. The night sky, if we could see in radio frequencies, would blaze with transmissions, a constant chatter of telemetry and data, of television signals and phone calls, of GPS timing codes and weather imagery, of reconnaissance data and scientific measurements, all flowing down from orbit, invisible rivers of information encoded in electromagnetic waves. But we cannot see radio waves, and so the sky appears as it has always appeared. Stars and planets, the moon in its phases, the occasional meteor, and the satellites remain hidden, except for those brief moments around dawn or dusk, when they catch sunlight while the ground below lies in shadow, appearing as moving stars. Bright points gliding steadily across the constellations, silent, unremarked by most who glimpse them. There is something appropriate in this invisibility, in the way satellites do their work unseen. They are not monuments, not spectacles, but instruments, tools, serving purposes both mundane and profound. They help us navigate, communicate, understand weather and climate, observe the universe beyond Earth. They have become woven into the infrastructure of modern civilization so thoroughly that their absence would be immediately, dramatically felt. Imagine a world without satellites, without GPS, without satellite communications, without weather forecasting based on orbital observations, without the early warning systems that watch for missile launches and natural disasters. The gap would be enormous, unbridgeable with ground-based technology alone. We have become dependent, perhaps unwisely so, on this infrastructure floating above us, vulnerable to solar storms, to debris impacts, to the eventual decay of orbits. But for now, tonight, they continue their rounds, each one following the mathematics of its particular trajectory, each one powered by sunlight converted to electricity, each one transmitting its signals earthward. They ask nothing, they complain of nothing, they simply persist, operating according to their programming until power fails or components break or propellant exhausts, and in their persistence, in their patient circling, there is something that speaks to human aspiration, to the desire to reach beyond immediate grasp, to see farther, to know more, to extend capability beyond the limits of flesh and atmosphere. They are ambassadors to a realm we can visit only briefly, envoys that remain when we must return to sea-level pressure and breathable air. The engineers who designed them, who built them, who launched them, most have moved on to other projects, retired, passed away, but their work continues, orbiting, measuring, transmitting. A satellite launched 30 years ago, if still functional, carries the knowledge and assumptions of 1994, frozen in metal and silicon, yet still serving, still contributing, still following the laws that Newton described and Kepler codified. As I consider this, as these thoughts settle into quieter patterns, I find myself grateful for the long view they provide, the perspective that shows Earth whole, bounded, beautiful and fragile, spinning through space with its thin envelope of air, its oceans and continents, its cities glowing at night like constellations. We are a planet that watches itself, that measures itself, that seeks to understand the systems that sustain it, and the satellites, these patient watchers, these silent travelers, continue their endless falling around the curve of the world, neither rising nor descending, but tracing their paths through the darkness, through the light, through the radiation and vacuum. They will be there tomorrow and the day after and for years to come, until one by one they fade, their missions complete, their orbits decayed, returning to Earth as brief streaks of light, or drifting into higher orbits where they will circle, silent and dark, for centuries we cannot imagine. The sky is vast and filled with invisible journeys, and the night continues, and somewhere above, the satellites trace their geometries, their ellipses and circles, their precise and perfect paths, falling forever, falling around home,